Section 45 of The Magic Mountain, Volume 2, by Thomas Mann. Translated by Helen Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 45. Chapter 7. Highly Questionable, Part 2. A small and select group assembled for the purpose, their theatre being Fraulein Kleefeld's room. Besides the hostess, Fraulein Brandt and Hans Castorp, there were only Frau Storr, Fraulein Levi, Herr Albin, the Czech Wenzel, and Dr. Ting Fu. In the evening, on the stroke of 10, they gathered privily, and in whispers mustered the apparatus Hermina had provided, consisting of a medium-sized round table, without a cloth, placed in the centre of the room, with a wine-glass upside down upon it, the foot in the air. Round the edge of the table, at regular intervals, were placed 26 little bone counters, each with a letter of the alphabet written on it in pen and ink. Fraulein Kleefeld served tea, which was gratefully received, as Frau Storr and Fraulein Levi, despite the harmlessness of the undertaking, complained of cold feet and palpitations. Cheered by the tea, they took their places about the table, in the rosy twilight dispensed by the pink-shaded table-lamp, as Fraulein Kleefeld, in concession to the mood of the gathering, had put out the ceiling light, and each of them laid a finger of his right hand lightly on the foot of the wine-glass. This was the prescribed technique. They waited for the glass to move. This should happen with ease. The top of the table was smooth, the rim of the glass well ground. The pressure of the tremulous fingers, however lightly laid on, certainly unequal, some of it being exerted vertically, some rather sideways, and probably in sufficient strength to cause the glass finally to move from its position in the centre of the table. On the periphery of its field it would come in contact with the marked counters, and if the letters on these, when put together, made words that conveyed any sort of sense, the resultant phenomenon would be complex and contaminate, a mixed product of conscious, half-conscious, and unconscious elements. The actual desire and pressure of some, to whom the wish was father to the act, whether or not they were aware of what they did, and the secret acquiescence of some dark stratum of the soul of the generality, a common, if subterranean effort towards seemingly strange experiences in which the suppressed self of the individual was more or less involved, most strongly, of course, that of little Ellie. This they all knew beforehand. Hans Castorp even blurted out something of the sort, after his fashion, as they sat and waited. The ladies' palpitation and cold extremities, the forced hilarity of the men, arose from their knowledge that they were come together in the night to embark on an unclean traffic with their own natures, a fearsome prying into unfamiliar regions of themselves, and that they were awaiting the appearance of those illusory or half-realities which we call magic. It was almost entirely for form's sake, and came quite conventionally, that they asked the spirits of the departed to speak to them through the movement of the glass. Herr Albin offered to be spokesman, and deal with such spirits as manifested themselves. He had already had a little experience at séances. 20 minutes or more went by. The whisperings had run dry. The first tension relaxed. They supported their right arms at the elbow with their left hands. The Czech Wenzel was almost dropping off. Ellen Brand rested her finger lightly on the glass, and directed her pure, childlike gaze away into the rosy light from the table lamp. Suddenly the glass tipped, knocked, and ran away from under their hands. They had difficulty in keeping their fingers on it. It pushed over to the very edge of the table, ran along it for a space, then slanted back nearly to the middle, tapped again, and remained quiet. They were all startled, favourably, yet with some alarm. Frau Storr whimpered that she would like to stop, but they told her she should have thought of that before. She must just keep quiet now. Things seemed in train. They stipulated that, in order to answer yes or no, the glass need not run to the letters, but might give 1 or 2 knocks instead. "Is there an intelligence present?" Herr Albin asked, severely directing his gaze over their heads into vacancy. After some hesitation, the glass tipped and said yes. "What is your name?" Herr Albin asked, almost gruffly, and emphasized his energetic speech by shaking his head. The glass pushed off. It ran with resolution from one point to another, executing a zigzag by returning each time a little distance toward the centre of the table. It visited H, O, and L, then seemed exhausted, but pulled itself together again and sought out the G and E and the R. Just as they thought. It was Holger in person, the spirit Holger, who understood such matters as the pinch of salt and that, but knew better than to mix into lessons at school. He was there, floating in the air above the heads of the little circle. What should they do with him? A certain diffidence possessed them. They took counsel behind their hands what they were to ask him. Herr Albin decided to question him about his position and occupation in life, and did so, as before, severely, with frowning brows, as though he were a cross-examining counsel. The glass was silent a while. Then it staggered over to the P, zigzagged, and returned to the O. Great suspense. Dr. Ting Fu giggled and said Holger must be a poet. Frau Storr began to laugh hysterically, which the glass appeared to resent, for after indicating the E, it struck and went no further. However, it seemed fairly clear that Dr. Ting Fu was right. What the deuce? So Holger was a poet. The glass revived and superfluously, in apparent pridefulness, rapped yes. A lyric poet? Fräulein Kleefeld asked. She said lyric, as Hans Castorp involuntarily noted. Holger was disinclined to specify. He gave no new answer, merely spelled out again, this time quickly and unhesitatingly, the word poet, adding the T he had left off before. Good then, a poet. The constraint increased. It was a constraint that in reality had to do with manifestations on the part of uncharted regions of their inner, their subjective selves, but which, because of the illusory, half-actual conditions of these manifestations, referred itself to the objective and external. Did Holger feel at home and content in his present state? Dreamily, the glass spelled out the word tranquil. Ah, tranquil. It was not a word one would have hit upon oneself, but after the glass spelled it out, they found it well chosen and probable. And how long had Holger been in this tranquil state? The answer to this was again something one would never have thought of, and dreamily answered it was a hastening while. Very good. As a piece of ventriloquistic poesy from the beyond, Hans Castorp in particular found it capital. A hastening while was the time element Holger lived in, and of course he had to answer as if it were in parables, having very likely forgotten how to use earthly terminology and standards of exact measurement. Frau Levi confessed her curiosity to know how he looked, or had looked, more or less. Had he been a handsome youth? Herr Albin said she might ask him herself. He found the request beneath his dignity. So she asked if the spirit had fair hair. "Beautiful brown curls," the glass responded, deliberately spelling out the word brown twice. There was much merriment over this. The ladies said they were in love with him. They kissed their hands at the ceiling. Dr. Ting Fu, giggling, said Mr. Holger must be rather vain. Ah, what a fury the glass fell into! It ran like mad about the table, quite at random, knocked with rage, fell over and rolled into Frau Storr's lap, who stretched out her arms and looked down at it, pallid with fear. They apologetically conveyed it back to its station and rebuked the Chinaman. How had he dared to say such a thing? Did he see what his indiscretion had led to? Suppose Holger was up and off in his wrath, and refused to say another word? They addressed themselves to the glass with the extreme of courtesy. Would Holger not make up some poetry for them? He had said he was a poet before he went to hover in the hastening while. Ah, how they all yearned to hear him versify! They would love it so. And lo, the good glass yielded and said yes. Truly there was something placable and good-humoured about the way it tapped. And then Holger the spirit began to poetize, and kept it up, copiously, circumstantially, without pausing for thought, for dear knows how long. It seemed impossible to stop him, for what a surprising poem it was, this ventriloquistic effort delivered to the admiration of the circle, stuff of magic, and shoreless as the sea of which it largely dealt. Sea-wrack in heaps and bands along the narrow strand of the broad-flung bay, an islanded coast girt by steep, cliffy dunes. Ah, see the dim green distance faint and die into eternity, while beneath broad veils of mist in dull carmine and milky radiance the summer sun delays to sink. No word can utter how and when the watery mirror turned from silver into untold changeful colour play, to bright or pale, to spreading opaline and moonstone gleams, or how, mysteriously as it came, the voiceless magic died away. The sea slumbered, yet the last traces of the sunset linger above and beyond. Until deep in the night it has not grown dark. A ghostly twilight reigns in the pine forests on the downs, bleaching the sand until it looks like snow. A simulated winter forest, all in silence, save where an owl wings rustling flight. Let us stray here at this hour, so soft the sand beneath our tread, so sublime, so mild the night. Far beneath us the sea respires slowly, and murmurs a long whispering in its dream. Does it crave thee to see it again? Step forth to the sallow, glacier-like cliffs of the dunes, and climb quite up into the softness that runs coolly into thy shoes. The land falls harsh and bushy, steeply down to the pebbly shore, and still the last parting remnants of the day haunt the edge of the vanishing sky. Lie down here in the sand. How cool as death it is, how soft as silk, as flower. It flows in a colourless, thin stream from thy hand, and makes a dainty little mound beside thee. Dost thou recognize it, this tiny flowing? It is the soundless, tiny stream through the hourglass, that solemn, fragile toy that adorns the hermit's hut. An open book, a skull, and in its slender frame the double glass, holding a little sand taken from eternity, to prolong here as time its troubling, solemn, mysterious essence. Thus Holger the Spirit and his lyric improvisation, ranging with weird flights of thought from the familiar seashore to the cell of a hermit and the tools of his mystic contemplation. And there was more human and divine, involved in daring and dreamlike terminology, over which the members of the little circle puzzled endlessly as they spelled it out, scarcely finding time for hurried though rapturous applause. So swiftly did the glass zigzag back and forth, so swiftly the words roll on and on. There was no distant prospect of a period, even an end of the hour. The glass improvised inexhaustibly of the pangs of birth and the first kiss of lovers, the crown of sorrows, the fatherly goodness of God, and plunged into the mysteries of creation, lost itself in other times and lands, in interstellar space, even mentioned the Chaldeans and the zodiac, and would certainly have gone on all night if the conspirators had not finally taken their fingers from the glass and expressed their gratitude to Holger, told him that must suffice them for the time. It had been wonderful beyond their wildest dreams. It was an everlasting pity there had been no one at hand to take it down, for now it must inevitably be forgotten. Yes, alas, they had already forgotten most of it, thanks to its quality, which made it hard to retain, as dreams are. Next time they must appoint an amanuensis to take it down, and see how it would look in black and white, and read connectedly. For the moment, however, and before Holger withdrew to the tranquillity of his hastening while, it would be better, and certainly most amiable of him, if he would consent to answer a few practical questions. They scarcely as yet knew what, but would he at least be in principle inclined to do so in his great amiability? The answer was yes. But now they discovered a great perplexity. What should they ask? It was as in the fairy story, when the fairy or elf grants one question, and there is a danger of letting the precious advantage slip through the fingers. There was much in the world, much of the future, that seemed worth knowing, yet it was so difficult to choose. At length, as no one seemed able to settle, Hans Castorp, with his finger on the glass, supporting his cheek in his fist, said he would like to know what was to be the actual length of his stay up here, instead of the 3 weeks originally fixed. Very well. Since they thought of nothing better, let the spirit, out of the fullness of his knowledge, answer this chance query. The glass hesitated, then pushed off. It spelled out something very queer, which none of them succeeded in fathoming. It made the word, or the syllable, go, and then the word slanting, and then something about Hans Castorp's room. The whole seemed to be a direction to go slanting through Hans Castorp's room. That was to say, through number 34. What was the sense of that? As they sat puzzling and shaking their heads, suddenly there came the heavy thump of a fist on the door. They all jumped. Was it a surprise? Was Dr. Krukowski standing without, come to break up the forbidden session? They looked up guiltily, expecting the betrayed one to enter. But then came a crashing knock on the middle of the table, as if to testify that the first knock too had come from the inside and not the outside of the room. They accused Herr Albin of perpetrating this rather contemptible jest, but he denied it on his honour, and even without his word they all felt fairly certain no one of their circle was guilty. Was it Holger, then? They looked at Ellie, suddenly struck by her silence. She was leaning back in her chair, with drooping wrists and fingertips poised on the table edge, her head bent on one shoulder, her eyebrows raised, her little mouth drawn down so that it looked even smaller, with a tiny smile that had something both silly and sly about it, and gazing into space with vacant, childlike blue eyes. They called to her, but she gave no sign of consciousness. And suddenly the night-table light went out. Went out. Frau Storr, beside herself, made great outcry, for she had heard the switch turned. The light, then, had not gone out, but had been put out by a hand which one characterized afar off in calling it a strange hand. Was it Holger's? Up to then he had been so mild, so tractable, so poetic. But now he seemed to degenerate into clownish practical jokes. Who knew that a hand that could so roundly thump doors and tables and knavishly turn off lights might not next catch hold of someone's throat? They called for matches, for pocket torches. Fraulein Levi shrieked out that someone had pulled her front hair. Frau Storr made no bones of calling aloud on God in her distress. "O Lord, forgive me this once," she moaned, and whimpered for mercy instead of justice, well knowing that she had tempted hell. It was Dr. Ting Fu who hit on the sound idea of turning on the ceiling light. The room was brilliantly illuminated straightway. They now established that the lamp on the night table had not gone out by chance, but been turned off, and only needed to have the switch turned back in order to burn again. But while this was happening, Hans Castorp made on his own account a most singular discovery, which might be regarded as a personal attention on the part of the dark powers here manifesting themselves with such childish perversity. A light object lay in his lap. He discovered it to be the souvenir which had once so surprised his uncle when he lifted it from his nephew's table, the glass diapositive of Claudia Schorschar's X-ray portrait. Quite uncontestably, he, Hans Castorp, had not carried it into the room. He put it into his pocket, unobservably. The others were busied about Ellen Brand, who remained sitting in her place in the same state, staring vacantly, with that curious simpering expression. Herr Albin blew in her face and imitated the upward sweeping motion of Dr. Krukowski, upon which she roused and incontinently wept a little. They caressed and comforted her, kissed her on the forehead, and sent her to bed. Fraulein Levi said she was willing to sleep with Frau Storr, for that abject creature confessed she was too frightened to go to bed alone. Hans Castorp, with his retrieved property in his breast pocket, had no objection to finishing off the evening with a cognac in Herr Albin's room. He had discovered, in fact, that this sort of thing affected neither the heart nor the spirits so much as the nerves of the stomach, a retroactive effect like seasickness, which sometimes troubles the traveller with qualms hours after he has set foot on shore. His curiosity was for the time quenched. Olga's poem had not been so bad, but the anticipated futility and vulgarity of the scene as a whole had been so unmistakable that he felt quite willing to let it go at these few vagrant sparks of hell fire. Herr Settembrini, to whom he related his experiences, strengthened this conviction with all his force. "That," he cried out, "was all that was lacking. Oh, misery, misery!" and cursorily dismissed little Ellie as a thorough-paced impostor. His pupil said neither yea nor nay to that. He shrugged his shoulders, and expressed the view that we did not seem to be altogether sure what constituted actuality, nor yet, in consequence, what imposture. Perhaps the boundary line was not constant. Perhaps there were transitional stages between the two, grades of actuality within nature, nature being, as she was, mute, not susceptible to valuation, and thus defying distinctions which in any case, it seemed to him, had a strongly moralizing flavour. What did Herr Settembrini think about delusions, which were a mixture of actuality and dream, perhaps less strange in nature than to our crude everyday processes of thought? The mystery of life was literally bottomless. What wonder, then, if sometimes illusions arose? And so on and so forth, in our hero's genial, confiding, loose and flowing style. Herr Settembrini duly gave him a dressing down, and did produce a temporary reaction of the conscience, even something like a promise to steer clear in the future of such abominations. "Have respect," he adjured him, "for your humanity, engineer. Confide in your God-given power of clear thought, and hold in abhorrence these luxations of the brain, these miasmas of the spirit. Delusions, the mystery of life, caro mio! When the moral courage to make decisions and distinctions between reality and deception degenerates to that point, then there is an end of life, of judgment, of the creative deed. The process of decay sets in, moral sepsis, and does its deadly work." Man, he went on to say, was the measure of things. His right to recognize and to distinguish between good and evil, reality and counterfeit, was indefeasible. Woe to them who dared to lead him astray in his belief in this creative right. Better for them that a millstone be hanged about their necks, and that they be drowned in the depth of the sea. Hans Castorp nodded assent, and in fact did for a while keep aloof from all such undertakings. He heard that Dr. Krokowski had begun holding séances with Ellen Brand in his subterranean cabinet, to which certain chosen ones of the guests were invited. But he nonchalantly put aside the invitation to join them, naturally not without hearing from them and from Krokowski himself something about the success they were having. It appeared that there had been wild and arbitrary exhibitions of power, like those in Fräulein Kleefeldt's room, knockings on walls and table, the turning off of the lamp, and these, as well as further manifestations, were being systematically produced and investigated with every possible safeguarding of their genuineness, after Comrade Krokowski had practised the approved technique and put little Ellie into her hypnotic sleep. They had discovered that the process was facilitated by music, and on these evenings the gramophone was preempted by the circle and carried down into the basement. But the Czech Wenzel, who operated it there, was not an unmusical man, and would surely not injure or misuse the instrument. Hans Castorp might hand it over without misgiving. He even chose a suitable album of records, containing light music, dances, small overtures, and such like tunable trifles. Little Ellie made no demands on a higher art, and they served the purpose admirably. To their accompaniment, Hans Castorp learned a handkerchief had been lifted from the floor, of its own motion, or rather that of the forbidden hand in its folds. The doctor's waste-paper basket had risen to the ceiling. The pendulum of a clock been alternately stopped and set going again, without anyone touching it. A table bell taken and rung. These and a good many other turbid and meaningless phenomena. The learned master of ceremonies was in the happy position of being able to characterize them by a Greek word, very scientific and impressive. They were, so he explained in his lectures and in private conversations, telekinetic phenomena, cases of movement from a distance. He associated them with a class of manifestations which were scientifically known as materializations, and toward which his plans and attempts with Ellie Brandt were directed. He talked to them about biopsychical projections of subconscious complexes into the objective, about transactions of which the medial constitution, the somnambulic state, was to be regarded as the source, and which one might speak of as objectivated dream concepts, insofar as they confirmed an ideoplastic property of nature, a power which, under certain conditions, appertained to thought, of drawing substance to itself and clothing itself in temporary reality. This substance streamed out from the body of the medium and developed extraneously into biological living end organs, these being the agencies which had performed the extraordinary though meaningless feats they witnessed in Dr. Krukowski's laboratory. Under some conditions these agencies might be seen or touched. The limbs left their impression in wax or plaster, but sometimes the matter did not rest with such corporalization. Under certain conditions, human heads, faces, full-length phantoms manifested themselves before the eyes of the experimenters, even within certain limits entered into contact with them. And here Dr. Krukowski's doctrine began, as it were, to squint, to look two ways at once. It took on a shifting and fluctuating character, like the method of treatment he had adopted in his exposition of the nature of love. It was no longer plain sailing, scientific treatment of the objectively mirrored subjective content of the medium and her passive auxiliaries. It was a mixing in the game, at least sometimes, at least half and half, of entities from without and beyond. It dealt, at least possibly, if not quite admittedly, with the non-vital, with existences that took advantage of a ticklish, mysteriously and momentarily favouring chance to return to substantiality and show themselves to their summoners, in brief, with the spiritualistic invocation of the departed. End of section 45. Section 46 of The Magic Mountain, Volume 2, by Thomas Mann. Translated by Helen Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 46. Chapter 7. Highly Questionable. Part 3. Such manifestations it was that Comrade Krukowski, with the assistance of his followers, was latterly striving to produce, sturdily, with his ingratiating smile, challenging their cordial confidence, thoroughly at home for his own person, in this questionable morass of the subhuman, and a born leader for the timid and compunctious in the regions where they now moved. He had laid himself out to develop and discipline the extraordinary powers of Ellen Brandt, and, from what Hans Castorp could hear, fortune smiled upon his efforts. Some of the party had felt the touch of materialized hands, while Paravant had received out of transcendency a sounding slap on the cheek, and had countered with scientific alacrity, yes, had even turned the other cheek, heedless of his quality as gentleman, jurist, and one-time member of a duelling corps, all of which would have constrained him to quite a different line of conduct had the blow been of terrestrial origin. A.K. Ferge, that good-natured martyr to whom all highbrow thought was foreign, had one evening held such a spirit hand in his own, and established by sense of touch that it was whole and well-shaped. His clasp had been heartfelt to the limits of respect, but it had, in some indescribable fashion, escaped him. A considerable period elapsed, some 2 months and a half of bi-weekly sittings, before a hand of otherworldly origin, a young man's hand, it seemed, came fingering over the table in the red glow of the paper-shaded lamp, and, plain to the eyes of all the circle, left its imprint in an earthenware basin full of flour. And 8 days later a troop of Krukowski's workers, Herr Albin, Frau Storr, the Magnuses, burst in upon Hans Castorp, where he sat dozing toward midnight in the biting cold of his balcony, and with every mark of distracted and feverish delight, their words tumbling over one another, announced that they had seen Ellie's Holger. He had shown his head over the shoulder of the little medium, and had in truth beautiful brown curls. He had smiled with such unforgettable, gentle melancholy as he vanished. Hans Castorp found this lofty melancholy scarcely consonant with Holger's other pranks, his impish and simple-minded tricks, the anything but gently melancholy snap he had given Lawyer Paravant, and the latter had pocketed up. It was apparent that one must not demand consistency of conduct. Perhaps they were dealing with a temperament like that of the little hunchbacked man in the nursery song, with his pathetic wickedness and his craving for intercession. Holger's admirers had no thought for all this. What they were determined to do was to persuade Hans Castorp to rescind his decree, positively, now that everything was so brilliantly in train. He must be present at the next séance. Ellie, it seemed, in her trance, had promised to materialize the spirit of any departed person the circle chose. Any departed person they chose. Hans Castorp still showed reluctance, but that it might be any person they chose occupied his mind to such an extent that in the next 3 days he came to a different conclusion. Strictly speaking, it was not 3 days, but as many minutes which brought about the change. One evening, in a solitary hour in the music-room, he played again the record that bore the imprint of Valentine's personality, to him so profoundly moving. He sat there listening to the soldierly prayer of the hero departing for the field of honour. "If God should summon me away, thee I would watch and guard alway, O Margarita." And, as ever, Hans Castorp was filled by emotion at the sound, an emotion which this time circumstances magnified, and, as it were, condensed into a longing. He thought, barren and sinful or no, it would be a marvellous thing, a daring adventure, and he, as I know him, if he had anything to do with it, would not mind. He recalled that composed and liberal "Certainly, of course," he had heard in the darkness of the X-ray laboratory when he asked Joachim if he might commit certain optical indiscretions. The next morning he announced his willingness to take part in the evening séance, and half an hour after dinner joined the group of familiars of the uncanny who, unconcernedly chatting, took their way down to the basement. They were all old inhabitants, the oldest of the old, or at least of long standing in the group, like the Czech Wenzel and Dr. Ting Fu, Ferge and Vaisel, Lawyer Paravant, the ladies Kleefeld and Levi, and, in addition, those persons who had come to his balcony to announce to him the apparition of Holger's head, and, of course, the medium, Ellie Brandt. That child of the north was already in the doctor's charge when Hans Castorp passed through the door with the visiting card. The doctor, in his black tunic, his arm laid fatherly over her shoulder, stood at the foot of the stair leading from the basement floor, and welcomed the guests, and she with him. Everybody greeted everybody else with surprising hilarity and expansiveness. It seemed to be the common aim to keep the meeting pitched in a key free from all solemnity or constraint. They talked in loud, cheery voices, poked each other in the ribs, showed every way how perfectly at ease they felt. Dr. Krokowski's yellow teeth kept gleaming in his beard with every hearty, confidence-inviting smile. He repeated his "welcome" to each arrival, with special fervour in Hans Castorp's case, who for his part said nothing at all, and whose manner was hesitating. "Courage, comrade!" Krokowski's energetic and hospitable nod seemed to be saying, as he gave the young man's hand an almost violent squeeze. No need here to hang the head. Here is no cant nor sanctimoniousness, nothing but the blithe and manly spirit of disinterested research. But Hans Castorp felt none the better for all this pantomime. He summed up the resolve formed by the memories of the X-ray cabinet, but the train of thought hardly fitted with his present frame. Rather, he was reminded of the peculiar and unforgettable mixture of feelings, nervousness, pridefulness, curiosity, disgust, and awe, with which, years ago, he had gone with some fellow students, a little tipsy, to a brothel in St. Pauli. As everyone was now present, Dr. Krokowski selected 2 controls, They were, for the evening, Frau Magnus and the ivory Levi, to preside over the physical examination of the medium, and they withdrew to the next room. Hans Castorp and the remaining 9 persons awaited in the consulting room the issue of the austerely scientific procedure, which was invariably without any result whatever. The room was familiar to him from the hours he had spent there, behind Joachim's back, in conversation with the psychoanalyst. It had a writing desk, an armchair and an easy-chair for patients on the left, the window side, a library of reference books on shelves to right and left of the side door, and in the further right-hand corner a chaise longue covered with oilcloth, separated by a folding screen from the desk and chairs. The doctor's glass instrument case also stood in that corner. In another was a bust of Hippocrates, while an engraving of Rembrandt's anatomy lesson hung above the gas fireplace on the right side wall. It was an ordinary consulting room, like thousands more, but with certain temporary special arrangements. The round mahogany table, whose place was in the centre of the room, beneath the electric chandelier, upon the red carpet that covered most of the floor, had been pushed forward against the left-hand wall, beneath the plaster bust, while a smaller table, covered with a cloth and bearing a red-shaped lamp, had been set obliquely near the gas fire, which was lighted and giving out a dry heat. Another electric bulb, covered with red and further with a black gauze veil, hung above the table. On this table stood certain notorious objects, table bells of different patterns, one to shake and one to press, the plate with flour, and the paper basket. Some dozen chairs of different shapes and sizes surrounded the table in a half circle, one end of which was formed by the foot of the chaise longue, the other ending near the centre of the room, beneath the ceiling light. Here, in the neighbourhood of the last chair, and about halfway to the door, stood the gramophone. The album of light trifles lay on a chair next to it. Such were the arrangements. The red lamps were not yet lighted. The ceiling light was shedding an effulgence as of common day, for the window above the narrow end of the writing desk was shrouded in a dark covering, with its openwork cream-coloured blind hanging down in front of it. After 10 minutes the doctor returned with the 3 ladies. Ellie's outer appearance had changed. She was not wearing her ordinary clothes, but a nightgown-like garment of white crape, girdled about the waist by a cord, leaving her slender arms bare. Her maidenly breasts showed themselves soft and unconfined beneath this garment. It appeared she wore little else. They all hailed her gaily. "Hello, Ellie! How lovely she looks again! A perfect fairy! Very pretty, my angel." She smiled at their compliments to her attire, probably well knowing it became her. "Preliminary control negative," Twikowski announced. "Let's get to work then, comrades," he said. Hans Castorp, conscious of being disagreeably affected by the doctor's manner of address, was about to follow the example of the others, who, shouting, chattering, slapping each other on the shoulders, were settling themselves in the circle of chairs, when the doctor addressed him personally. "My friend," said he, "you are a guest, perhaps a novice in our midst, and therefore I should like, this evening, to pay you special honour. I confide to you the control of the medium. Our practice is as follows." He ushered the young man toward the end of the circle next the chaise longue and the screen, where Ellie was seated on an ordinary cane chair, with her face turned rather toward the entrance door and to the centre of the room. He himself sat down close in front of her in another such chair, and clasped her hands, at the same time holding both her knees firmly between his own. "Like that," he said, and gave his place to Hans Castorp, who assumed the same position. "You'll grant that the arrest is complete, but we shall give you assistance too. Fräulein Kleefeld, I implore you to lend us your aid." And the lady, thus courteously and exotically entreated, came and sat down, clasping Ellie's fragile wrists, one in each hand. Unavoidable that Hans Castorp should look into the face of the young prodigy, fixed as it was so immediately before his own. Their eyes met, but Ellie's slipped aside and gazed with natural self-consciousness in her lap. She was smiling a little affectedly, with her lips slightly pursed, and her head on one side, as she had at the wine-glass séance, and Hans Castorp was reminded, as he saw her, of something else, the look on Karen Carsted's face, a smile just like that, when she stood with Joachim and himself and regarded the unmade grave in the Dorf graveyard. The circle had sat down. They were 13 persons, not counting the Czech Wenzel, whose function was to serve Polyhymnia, and who, accordingly, after putting his instrument in readiness, squatted with his guitar at the back of the circle. Dr. Krakowski sat beneath the chandelier at the other end of the row, after he had turned on both red lamps with a single switch and turned off the centre light. A darkness, gently aglow, lay over the room. The corners and distances were obscured. Only the surface of the little table and its immediate vicinity were illumined by a pale rosy light. During the next few minutes one scarcely saw one's neighbours. Then their eyes slowly accustomed themselves to the darkness and made the best use of the light they had, which was slightly reinforced by the small dancing flames from the chimney-piece. The doctor devoted a few words to this matter of the lighting, and excused its lacks from the scientific point of view. They must take care not to interpret it in the sense of deliberate mystification and scene-setting. With the best will in the world, they could not, unfortunately, have more light for the present. The nature of the powers they were to study would not permit of their being developed with white light. It was not possible thus to produce the desired conditions. This was a fixed postulate, with which they must for the present reckon. Hans Castorp, for his part, was quite satisfied. He liked the darkness. It mitigated the queerness of the situation, and in its justification he recalled the darkness of the X-ray room, and how they had collected themselves and washed their eyes in it before they saw. The medium, Dr. Krakowski went on, obviously addressing his words to Hans Castorp in particular, no longer needed to be put in the trance by the physician. She fell into it herself, as the control would see, and once she had done so, it would be her guardian spirit Holger who spoke with her voice, to whom and not to her they should address themselves. Further, it was an error which might result in failure to suppose that one must bend mind or will upon the expected phenomena. On the contrary, a slightly diffused attention with conversation was recommended, and Hans Castorp was cautioned, whatever else he did, not to lose control of the medium's extremities. "We will now form the chain," finished Dr. Krakowski, and they did so, laughing when they could not find each other's hands in the dark. Dr. Ting Fu, sitting next to Hermine Kleefeld, laid his right hand on her shoulder and reached his left to Herr Wesel, who came next. Beyond him were Herr and Frau Magnus, then A.K. Ferge, who, if Hans Castorp mistook not, held the hand of the ivory Levi on his right, and so on. "Music!" the doctor commanded, and behind him his neighbour the Czech set the instrument in motion and placed the needle on the disc. "Talk!" Krakowski bade them, and as the first bars of an overture by Milocker were heard, they obediently bestirred themselves to make conversation about nothing at all. The winter snowfall, the last course at dinner, a newly arrived patient, a departure, wild or otherwise, artificially sustained, half drowned by the music, and lapsing now and again. So some minutes passed. End of section 46. Section 47 of The Magic Mountain, Volume 2, by Thomas Mann. Translated by Helen Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 47. Chapter 7. Highly Questionable. Part 4. The record had not run out before Ellie shuddered violently. A trembling ran through her. She sighed. The upper part of her body sank forward, so that her forehead rested against Hans Castorp's, and her arms, together with those of her guardians, began to make extraordinary pumping motions to and fro. "Trance!" announced the Kleefeld. The music stopped, so also the conversation. In the abrupt silence they heard the baritone drawl of the doctor. Is Holger present? Ellie shivered again. She swayed in her chair. Then Hans Castorp felt her press his 2 hands with a quick, firm pressure. She pressed my hands, he informed them. He, the doctor corrected him. He pressed your hands. He is present. Welcome, Holger, he went on with unction. Welcome, friend and fellow comrade. Heartily welcome. And remember when you were last with us, he went on, and Hans Castorp remarked that he did not use the form of address common to the civilized West. You promised to make visible to our mortal eyes some dear departed, whether brother soul or sister soul, whose name shall be given to you by our circle. Are you willing? Do you feel yourself able to perform what you promised? Again Ellie shivered. She sighed and shivered as the answer came. Slowly she carried her hands and those of her guardians to her forehead, where she let them rest. Then, close to Hans Castorp's ear, she whispered, Yes. The warm breath immediately at his ear caused in our friend that phenomenon of the epidermis, popularly called goose-flesh, the nature of which the Hofrat had once explained to him. We mention this in order to make a distinction between the psychical and the purely physical. There could scarcely be talk of fear, for our hero was in fact thinking, well, she is certainly biting off more than she can chew. But then he was straightway seized with a mingling of sympathy and consternation, springing from the confusing and illusory circumstance that a blood-young creature, whose hands he held in his, had just breathed a yes in his ear. He said yes, he reported, and felt embarrassed. Very well then, Holger, spoke Dr. Krukowski. We shall take you at your word. We are confident you will do your part. The name of the dear departed shall shortly be communicated to you. Comrades, he turned to the gathering, out with it now. Who has a wish? Whom shall our friend Holger show us? A silence followed. Each waited for the other to speak. Individually they had probably all questioned themselves in these last few days. They knew whither their thoughts tended. But the calling back of the dead, or the desirability of calling them back, was a ticklish matter, after all. At bottom, and boldly confessed, the desire does not exist. It is a misapprehension precisely as impossible as the thing itself, as we should soon see if nature once let it happen. What we call mourning for our dead is perhaps not so much grief at not being able to call them back, as it is grief at not being able to want to do so. This was what they were all obscurely feeling, and since it was here simply a question not of an actual return, but merely a theatrical staging of one, in which they should only see the departed, no more, the thing seemed humanly unthinkable. They were afraid to look into the face of him or her whom they thought, and each one would willingly have resigned his right of choice to the next. Hans Castorp, too, though there was echoing in his ears that large-hearted of course, out of the past, held back, and at the last moment was rather inclined to pass the choice on. But the pause was too long. He turned his head toward their leader and said in a husky voice, I should like to see my departed cousin, Joachim Seimson. That was a relief to them all. Of those present, all, excepting Dr. Ting Fu, Wenzel, and the medium, had known the person asked for. The others, Ferge, Wesel, Herr Albin, Paravant, Herr and Frau Magnus, Frau Storr, Fraulein Levi, and Kleefeld, loudly announced their satisfaction with the choice. Krukowski himself nodded well pleased, though his relations with Joachim had always been rather cool, owing to the latter's reluctance in the matter of psychoanalysis. Very good indeed, said the doctor. Holger, did you hear? The person named was a stranger to you in life. Do you know him in the beyond, and are you prepared to lead him hither? Immense suspense. The sleeper swayed, sighed, and shuddered. She seemed to be seeking, to be struggling, falling this way and that, whispering now to Hans Castorp, now to the Kleefeld, something they could not catch. At last he received from her hands the pressure that meant yes. He announced himself to have done so, and "Very well, then," cried Dr. Krokowski. "To work, Holger! Music!" he cried. "Conversation!" And he repeated the injunction that no fixing of the attention, no strained anticipation was in place, but only an unforced and hovering expectancy. And now followed the most extraordinary hours of our hero's young life. Yes, though his later fate was unclear, though at a certain moment in his destiny he will vanish from our eyes, we may assume them to have been the most extraordinary he ever spent. They were hours, more than 2 of them, to be explicit, counting in a brief intermission in the efforts on Holger's part, which now began, or rather on the girl Ellie's, of work so hard and so prolonged that they were all toward the end inclined to be faint-hearted and despair of any result. Out of pure pity, too, tempted to resign an attempt which seemed pitilessly hard and beyond the delicate strength of her upon whom it was laid. We men, if we do not shirk our humanity, are familiar with an hour of life when we know this almost intolerable pity, which, absurdly enough, no one else can feel, this rebellious "enough, no more," which is wrung from us, though it is not enough, and cannot or will not be enough, until it comes somehow or other to its appointed end. The reader knows we speak of our husband and fatherhood, of the act of birth, which Ellie's wrestling did so unmistakably resemble that even he must recognize it who had never passed through this experience, even our own young Hans Castorp, who, not having shirked life, now came to know in such a guise this act so full of organic mysticism. In what guise? To what end? Under what circumstances? One could not regard as anything less than scandalous the sights and sounds in this red-lighted lying-in chamber. The maidenly form of the pregnant one, bare-armed in flowing night-robe, and by contrast the ceaseless and senseless gramophone music, the forced conversation which the circle kept up at command, the cries of encouragement they ever and anon directed at the struggling one. "Hullo, Holger! Courage, man! It's coming! Just keep it up! Let it come! That's the way!" Nor do we accept the person and situation of the husband, if we may regard in that light our young friend, who had indeed formed such a wish, sitting there with the knees of the little mother between his own, holding in his her hands, which were as wet as once little Layla's, so that he had constantly to be renewing his hold, not to let them slip, for the gas fire in the rear of the circle radiated great heat. Mystical, consecrate. Ah, no, it was all rather noisy and vulgar there in the red glow, to which they had now so accustomed their eyes that they could see the whole room fairly well. The music and shouting were so like the revivalist methods of the Salvation Army, they even made Hans Castorp think of the comparison, albeit he had never attended at a celebration by these cheerful zealots. It was in no eerie or ghostly sense that the scene affected the sympathetic one as mystic or mysterious, as conducing to solemnity. It was rather natural, organic, by virtue of the intimate association we have already referred to. Ellie's exertions came in waves, after periods of rest, during which she hung sidewise from her chair in a totally relaxed and inaccessible condition, described by Dr. Krokowski as deep trance. From this she would start up with a moan, throw herself about, strain and wrestle with her captors, whisper feverish, disconnected words, seem to be trying, with sidewise jerking movements, to expel something. She would gnash her teeth, once even fastened them in Hans Castorp's sleeve. This had gone on for more than an hour, when the leader found it to the interest of all concerned to grant a brief intermission. The Czech Wenzel, who had introduced an enlivened variation by closing the gramophone and striking up very expertly on his guitar, laid that instrument aside. They all drew long breath and broke the circle. Dr. Krokowski strode over to the wall and switched on the ceiling lamp. The light flashed up glaringly, making them all blink. Ellie, bent forward, her head almost in her lap, slumbered. She was busy, too, absorbed in the oddest activity, with which the others appeared familiar, but which Hans Castorp watched with attentive wonder. For some minutes together she moved the hollow of her hand to and fro in the region of her hips, carried the hand away from her body, and then, with a swooping, raking motion, drew it toward her as though gathering something and pulling it in. Then, with a series of starts, she came to herself, blinked in her turn at the light with sleep-stiffened eyes, and smiled. She smiled affectedly, rather remotely. In truth, their solicitude seemed wasted. She did not appear exhausted by her efforts. Perhaps she retained no memory of them. She sat down in the chair reserved for patients, by the writing desk near the window, between the desk and the screen about the chaise longue, gave the chair a turn so that she could support her elbow on the desk and look into the room, and remained thus, receiving their sympathetic glances and encouraging nods, silent during the whole intermission, which lasted 15 minutes. It was a beneficent pause, relaxed and filled with peaceful satisfaction in respect of work already accomplished. The lids of cigarette cases snapped, the men smoked comfortably, and standing in groups discussed the prospects of the séance. They were far from despairing or anticipating a negative result to their efforts. Signs enough were present to prove such doubting uncalled for. Those sitting near the door, at the far end of the row, agreed that they had several times felt, quite unmistakably, that current of cool air which regularly, whenever manifestations were under way, streamed in a definite direction from the person of the medium. Others had seen light phenomena, white spots, moving conglobulations of forces showing themselves at intervals against the screen. In short, no faint-heartedness, no looking backward now they had put their hands to the plough. Holger had given his word. They had no call to doubt that he would keep it. Dr. Krokowski signed for the resumption of the sitting. He led Ellie back to her martyrdom and seated her, stroking her hair. The others closed the circle. All went as before. Hans Castorp suggested that he be released from his post of first control, but Dr. Krokowski refused. He said he laid great stress on excluding, by immediate contact, every possibility of misleading manipulation on the part of the medium. So Hans Castorp took up again his strange position vis-à-vis to Ellie. The white light gave place to rosy twilight. The music began again, the pumping motions. This time it was Hans Castorp who announced trance. The scandalous lying-in proceeded. With what distressful difficulty! It seemed unwilling to take its course. But how could it? Madness! What maternity was this? What delivery? Of what should she be delivered? Help! Help! The child moaned, and her spasms seemed to pass over into that dangerous and unavailing stage obstetricians called eclampsia. She called at intervals on the doctor that he should put his hands on her. He did so, speaking to her encouragingly. The magnetic effect, if such it was, strengthened her to further efforts. Thus passed the second hour, while the guitar was strummed, or the gramophone gave out the contents of the album of light music into the twilight to which they had again accustomed their vision. Then came an episode introduced by Hans Castorp. He supplied a stimulus by expressing an idea, a wish he had cherished from the beginning, and might perhaps have profitably expressed before now. Ellie was sitting with her face on their joined hands in deep trance. Herr Wenzel was just changing or reversing the record, when our friend summoned his resolution and said he had a suggestion to make, of no great importance, yet perhaps, possibly, of some avail. He had, that is, the house possessed among its volumes of records, a certain song from Gounod's Faust, Valentine's Prayer, baritone with orchestral accompaniment, very appealing. He, the speaker, thought they might try the record. "Why that particular one?" the doctor asked out of the darkness. "A question of mood, matter of feeling," the young man responded. The mood of the piece in question was peculiar to itself, quite special. He suggested they should try it. Just possible, not out of the question, that its mood and atmosphere might shorten their labours. "Is the record here?" the doctor inquired. No, but Hans Castorp could fetch it at once. "What are you thinking of?" Krokowski promptly repelled the idea. What? Hans Castorp thought he might go and come again and take up his business where he had left it off. There spoke the voice of utter inexperience. Oh no, it was impossible. It would upset everything. They would have to begin all over. Scientific exactitude forbade them to think of any such arbitrary going in and out. The door was locked. He, the doctor, had the key in his pocket. In short, if the record was not now in the room— He was still talking when the check threw in from the gramophone, "The record is here." "Here?" Hans Castorp asked. "Yes, here it is. Faust, Valentine's Prayer." It had been stuck by mistake in the album of light music, not in the green album of arias where it belonged. Quite by chance, or mismanagement, or carelessness, in any case, luckily, it had partaken of the general topsy-turviness, and here it was, needing only to be put on. What had Hans Castorp to say to that? Nothing. It was the doctor who remarked, "So much the better," and some of the others chimed in. The needle scraped, the lid was put down, the male voice began to choral accompaniment. "Now the parting hour has come." No one spoke. They listened. Ellie, as the music resumed, renewed her efforts. She started up, convulsively pumped, carried the slippery arms to her brow. The record went on, came to the middle part, with skipping rhythm, the part about war and danger, gallant, God-fearing, French. After that, the finale in full volume, the orchestrally supported refrain of the beginning, "O Lord of Heaven, hear me pray." Hans Castorp had work with Ellie. She raised herself, threw in a straggling breath, sighed a long, long outward sigh, sank down, and was still. He bent over her in concern, and as he did so he heard Frau Storr say in a high piping whine, "Sein Sohn." He did not look up. A bitter taste came in his mouth. He heard another voice, a deep, cold voice, saying, "I've seen him a long time." The record had run off with the last accord of horns, but no one stopped the machine. The needle went on scratching in the silence as the disc whirred round. Then Hans Castorp raised his head, and his eyes went, without searching, the right way. There was one more person in the room than before. There in the background, where the red rays lost themselves in gloom, so that the eye scarcely reached thither, between the writing desk and the screen, in the doctor's consulting chair, where in the intermission Ellie had been sitting, Joachim sat. It was the Joachim of the last days, with hollow, shadowy cheeks, warrior's beard, and full, curling lips. He sat leaning back, one leg crossed over the other. On his wasted face, shaded though it was by his head covering, was plainly seen the stamp of suffering, the expression of gravity and austerity which had beautified it. Two folds stood on his brow, between the eyes that lay deep in their bony cavities, but there was no change in the mildness of the great dark orbs, whose quiet, friendly gaze sought out Hans Castorp, and him alone. That ancient grievance of the outstanding ears was still to be seen under the head covering, his extraordinary head covering, which they could not make out. Cousin Joachim was not in mufti. His sabre seemed to be leaning against his leg. He held the handle. One thought to distinguish something like a pistol case in his belt. But that was no proper uniform he wore. No colour, no decorations. It had a collar like a Lightfoot jacket, and side pockets. Somewhere, low down on the breast, was a cross. His feet looked large, his legs very thin. They seemed to be bound or wound as for the business of sport more than war. And what was it, this headgear? It seemed as though Joachim had turned an army cookpot upside down on his head and fastened it under his chin with a band. Yet it looked quite properly warlike, like an old-fashioned foot soldier, perhaps. Hans Castorp felt Ellen Brand's breath on his hands, and near him the Kleefeld's rapid breathing. Other sound there was none, save the continued scraping of the needle on the run-down rotating record, which nobody stopped. He looked at none of his company, would hear or see nothing of them, but across the hand and head of his knee leaned far forward and stared through the red darkness at the guest in the chair. It seemed one moment as though his stomach would turn over within him. His throat contracted, and a 4- or 5-fold sob went through and through him. "Forgive me," he whispered. Then his eyes overflowed. He saw no more. He heard breathless voices. "Speak to him!" He heard Dr. Krokowski's baritone voice summon him formally, cheerily, and repeat the request. Instead of complying, he drew his hands away from beneath Ellie's face and stood up. Again Dr. Krokowski called upon his name, this time in monitory tones. But in 2 strides Hans Castorp was at the step by the entrance door, and with one quick movement turned on the white light. Frau Brand had collapsed. She was twitching convulsively in the Kleefeldts' arms. The chair over there was empty. Hans Castorp went up to the protesting Krokowski, close up to him. He tried to speak, but no words came. He put out his hand with a brusque, imperative gesture. Receiving the key, he nodded several times, threateningly, close into the other's face, turned, and went out of the room. End of section 47. Section 48 of The Magic Mountain, Volume 2, by Thomas Mann. Translated by Helen Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 48. Chapter 7. Hysterica Passio, Part 1. With the swift changing years, a spirit began to walk in House Berkoff, a spirit of immediate descent, or so Hans Castorp surmised, from that other demon whose baleful name we have spoken. With the facile curiosity of inquiring youth on its travels, he had studied this new demon, yes, had even discovered in himself an alarming aptitude, in common with the rest of the world up here, to pay him extensive homage. This new evil genius had, like the other, always been present, as it were, in the germ, but now it began to spread itself. Hans Castorp had by nature no great predilection for becoming its slave, yet with something like horror he observed that even he, when he let himself go ever so little, fell victim to a contagion so general that scarce anyone in the circle escaped it. What was this, then? What was in the air? A rising temper, acute irritability, a nameless rancour, a universal tendency to envenomed exchange of words, to outbursts of rage, yes, even to fisticuffs, embittered disputes, bouts of uncontrolled shrieking by pairs and by groups, were of daily occurrence. And the significant thing was that the bystanders, instead of being disgusted with the participants, or seeking to come between them, actually sympathized with one side or the other to the extent of being themselves involved in the quarrel. They would pale and tremble, their eyes would glitter provocatively, their mouths set with passion. They envied those actively engaged the chance, the justification for screaming. A gnawing desire to do so likewise possessed mind and body, and he who could not summon strength to flee apart was soon willy-nilly in the midst of the melee. The fruitless dissensions, the mutual recriminations, in the face of authorities bent on accommodation, but themselves falling with alarming ease a prey to the general temptation to brawl, these became frequent occurrences in House Berkoff. A patient might issue forth of the house in tolerable tranquillity, and not know at all in what frame he would return. A member of the good Russian table, an elegant dame from the provinces, from Minsk, still young and a light case, with only 3 months prescribed, betook herself one day to the village to make purchases at the French lingerie shop, fell there into a quarrel with the modiste, of such dimensions that she came back in a state of violent excitement, suffered a hemorrhage, and was thenceforth incurable. The husband was summoned and informed that her stay up here would terminate only with her life. Her case aptly illustrates the general mood. Albeit with some distaste, we cite others. Our readers may remember the greedy schoolboy in the round spectacles, who sat at Frau Solomon's table and had a habit of cutting up all the food on his plate into a sort of mess, and gulping it down, now and again wiping his eyes with his serviette behind his heavy spectacle lenses. He had sat there, still a schoolboy, or rather still a former schoolboy, all this time, gobbled and wiped, without drawing upon his person more than the most cursory attention. But now one morning at early breakfast, out of a blue sky, he was overtaken by such a transport of disorder that half the dining-room started up at the noise coming from his quarter. He sat there all pale and shrieking, and it was at the dwarf waitress standing near him that he shrieked. "You lie!" he yelled, his voice breaking. "It's ice cold. This tea you have brought me is ice cold, I tell you. Try it yourself before you lie to me again about it. It's just lukewarm wash-water. Try it if it isn't. Not fit for a decent person to drink. How do you dare think of bringing me ice-cold tea and setting it in front of me and actually persuading yourself that I would drink such hogwash? I won't drink it, I won't!" he screamed, and began pounding with his fists on the table till the dishes rang. "I will have hot tea, boiling hot. That is my right before God and man. Boiling hot. I'd rather die on the spot than take a drop of this, you damned dwarf, you!" he fairly bellowed, and with the words appeared to fling off the last vestige of restraint and go stark mad, shaking his fist at Emerentia, literally showing her his foaming teeth. He went on, stamping, pounding, yelling, "I will!" and "I won't!" while the dining-room displayed the now usual scene. There was tense and alarming participation in the schoolboy raving. Some of the guests even sprang up and glared, fists doubled, teeth clenched. Others sat white and trembling, their eyes cast down, and they still glared or trembled long after the schoolboy had spent himself and sat in a collapse before his fresh tea, not drinking. What was all this? Among the Burkoff community sat a former businessman, some 30 years old. His case was long-standing. He had wandered for years from one establishment to another. This man was a confirmed anti-Semite, out of conviction and the sporting instinct. He devoted a joyous consistency to the game, and the preaching of this negative gospel was the pride and content of his life. Businessman he had been. He was no more. He was nothing more in the world, but he was still an anti-Semite. His illness was serious. He had a burdensome cough, and made a sound as though he sneezed in his lung, a short, high-pitched, uncanny sound. But he was no Jew, and that was his one positive characteristic. His name was Weidemann, a Christian name, not a filthy Jewish. He took in a paper called the Aryan Sun, and would talk in this wise. "I arrive at the A sanatorium in B. When I go to sit down in my chair in the rest hall, who do I find on my right hand? Herr Hirsch. And whom do I find on my left? Herr Wolf. Of course, I leave." And so on. Weidemann had a quick, threatening glance. It was literally as though he had a punching ball hanging close in front of his nose and squinted at it, seeing nothing whatever beyond. The prejudice that haunted him was grown to an itch, a ceaseless persecution mania, which led him to smell out the vileness hidden or disguised in his neighbourhood, and hold it up to scorn. Wherever he went, he suspected, he jibed, he vented his spleen. In short, his days were filled with hunting out and hounding down all his fellow creatures who did not possess that inestimable advantage which was the only one he had. The prevailing temper in House Burkoff, which we have been indicating, aggravated Weidemann's complaint to an abnormal pitch. Naturally, he could not fail here to come into contact with persons suffering from the disability of which he was free, and so it came to a scene in which Hans Castorp was present, and which will serve us as a further illustration of our theme. For there was another man. No possibility of concealing what he was. The case was clear. The man's name was Sonnenschein, than which he could bear no filthier, and thus he became for Weidemann the punching ball in front of his nose, at which he squinted with his threatening glare, at which he struck, not so much to drive it away as to set it in motion that it might rasp his nerves the more. Sonnenschein, like the other, was a business man, born and bred. He too was critically ill, and illness made him sensitive. A friendly man, not at all a dull one, by nature rather playful. He hated Weidemann for his jibes and stabs, as Weidemann hated him, and one afternoon things came to a head down in the hall. They fell on each other like beasts. It was a horrid sight. They scuffled like small boys, but with the grimness of grown men when things have got to such a pitch. They clawed at each other's faces, clutched throats or noses, grappled, hewed loose from each other, and rolled together on the floor, spat, kicked, worried, and foamed at the mouth. The management came running, and by main strength dragged them asunder, scratched and bitten. Herr Weidemann, bleeding and frothing, his face brutish with rage, displayed a phenomenon Hans Castorp had never before seen, and had always supposed a figure of speech. His hair stood on end. He staggered away. Herr Sonnenschein, with one black eye, a bleeding lacuna in the curling black locks about his brow, was led into the bureau, where he sat down, buried his face in his hands, and wept bitterly. Thus Weidemann and Sonnenschein. All those who saw the encounter trembled hours after. Let us turn from it to a real affair of honour, which by contrast with such ignominy will seem almost refreshing. This affair of honour occurred at about the same period, and, on account of the solemn formality with which it was conducted, deserved the name, even to the point of absurdity. Hans Castorp did not assist in person at the successive episodes, but was informed of its involved and dramatic course by means of certain documents, protocols, and formal declarations touching the affair, circulated not only in the house and without, not only in the village, the canton, and the country, but even abroad and in America, and presented for the consideration of persons who most certainly were not in the faintest degree interested in the circumstances. It was a Polish affair, a pain in the honour, having its seat in the heart of the Polish group which had lately collected in the Berkow, a little colony which preempted the good Russian table. Hans Castorp, be it said in passing, sat there no longer, having moved thence to the Kleefelds, then to Frau Salomons, finally to Fraulein Levi's. Social relations in the Polish group were so elegant, so courtly, so polished, that one could only elevate one's eyebrows and be prepared for anything. There was a married couple and an unmarried young female who stood in friendly relations with one of the gentlemen. The rest were male, with such names as von Zudowski, Szynski, von Rosinski, Michael Lodigowski, Leo von Asaparetian, and others. Now it fell out that one of them, named Japol, drinking champagne in the restaurant with two others of the party, made, in their presence, remarks of a certain nature about the wife of Herr von Zudowski, and about the young lady named Krylov, who was the intimate friend of Herr Lodigowski, and from this circumstance arose all the proceedings, acts, and formalities which were the theme of a widely circulated composition. Hans Castorp read: Declaration, translated from the Polish original. On the 27th of March, 19 Monsieur Stanislaw von Zudowski addressed himself to Messieurs Dr. Anton Szynski and Stefan von Rosinski, with the request that they should betake themselves to Monsieur Casimir Japol, and in his name demand satisfaction, in the usual way, for the calumny and detraction which the said Monsieur Casimir Japol had been guilty of against Monsieur Stanislaw von Zudowski's wife, Jadwiga von Zudowska, in the presence of and in conversation with Messieurs Janusz Theophil Lenart and Leo von Asapetian. And the above conversation, which took place at the end of November, came indirectly to Monsieur von Zudowski's knowledge, he took immediate steps to assure himself of the fact, and the circumstances of the calumny and detraction. On the previous day, the 27th of March, 19 , he was able to confirm the fact of the said calumny and detraction by the mouth of an immediate witness to the conversation in which the offensive words and insinuations had been uttered, and thus Monsieur Stanislaw von Suzdalski was constrained to apply, without delay, to the undersigned, and to authorize them to institute honourable proceedings against the said Monsieur Casimir Japol. The undersigned make the following statement. 1. On the basis of a protocol of the 9th of April, 19 , drawn up at the instance of one party, written at Lemberg by Monsieur Zisto Zhigulski and Tadeusz Kadi, in the affair of Monsieur Ladislaw Godolensky versus Monsieur Casimir Japol, and further on the basis of the declaration of the Court of Honour of the 18th of June, 19 , drawn up in Lemberg with reference to the same affair, both which documents agree in establishing that Monsieur Casimir Japol, in consequence of repeated conduct not to be reconciled with the principles of honour, cannot be regarded as a gentleman. 2. The undersigned, having reference to the significant conclusions to be deduced from the foregoing, assert and confirm the absolute impossibility of any longer considering Monsieur Casimir Japol as capable of affording satisfaction. 3. And the undersigned, for their own persons, consider it inadmissible, with reference to a man who stands outside the pale of honour, to act either as principals or as seconds to any affair of honour. With reference to this state of affairs, the undersigned informed Monsieur Stanislaw von Suzdalski that it would be fruitless to proceed against Monsieur Casimir Japol, according to the procedure laid down in the affairs of honour, and recommend him instead to have recourse to a criminal court, in order to prevent further injury on the part of a person otherwise incapacitated from giving satisfaction. Dated and signed, Dr. Anton Zizinski, Stefan von Rzinski. And further, Hans Castorp read, Protocol of witnesses to the affair between Monsieur Stanislaw von Suzdalski, Monsieur Michael Lodigowski, and Messieurs Casimir Japol and Janus Theophil-Lenart in the bar of the Kirkhouse in K, and on the 2nd of April, 19 , between 7:30 and 7:45. As Monsieur Stanislaw von Suzdalski, with reference to the representations of his friends, Messieurs Dr. Anton Zizinski and Stefan von Rzinski, in connection with the occurrences of the 27th of March, 19 , and after mature consideration came to the conclusion that the taking of the judicial steps which they recommended against Monsieur Casimir Japol for the calumny and detraction uttered against his wife Jadwiga would afford him no satisfaction whatever, since 1. There was a justifiable suspicion that Monsieur Casimir Japol would not appear before the court, and since, he being an Austrian subject, further proceedings would be difficult, if not impossible. 2. And since furthermore a legal chastisement of Monsieur Casimir Japol would in no wise atone for the insult by which he had sought to injure and defame the name and family of Monsieur Stanislaw von Suzdalski, now therefore Monsieur Stanislaw von Suzdalski took what appeared to him the shortest, most thorough, and in view of the circumstances most appropriate course, after having indirectly ascertained that Monsieur Casimir Japol purposed leaving the place on the following day, and on the 2nd of April, 19 , between 7:30 and 7:45 in the evening, in the presence of his wife Jadwiga and Messieurs Michael Lodigowski and Ignaz von Melin, administered several boxes on the ear of Monsieur Casimir Japol, who was seated in the company of Monsieur Janus Theophil-Lenart and 2 unknown young women in the American bar of the Kirkhouse, imbibing alcoholic drinks. Immediately thereafter, Monsieur Michael Lodigowski boxed the ears of Monsieur Casimir Japol, stating that he did so in return for the insult offered to Fraulein Kryloff and himself. And immediately thereafter, Monsieur Michael Lodigowski boxed the ears of Monsieur Janus Theophil-Lenart in return for the unqualifiable injury offered to Monsieur and Madame von Suzdalski, And further, without losing a moment, Monsieur Stanislav von Sadowski likewise and repeatedly boxed the ears of Monsieur Janus Theophylact for the calumnious defamation of his wife, as well as Mademoiselle Krylov. Messieurs Casimir Japol and Janus Theophylact remained entirely passive during the whole of the above proceedings. Signed and dated Michael Lodigowski, Ign V. Mellin. The prevailing temper did not permit Hans Castorp to laugh, as he would otherwise surely have done, at this rapid fire of boxes on the ear. Instead, he quaked as he read. The irreproachable bearing of the one side, the contemptibleness and total lack of self-respect of the other were both apparent in the document, which was, despite its frigid objectivity, so impressive as to move him deeply. So it was with them all. The Polish affaire d'honneur was conned far and wide, and discussed through clenched teeth. A counterblast by Herr Casimir Japol fell rather flat. The substance of it was that Sutowski had been perfectly aware that he, Japol, had been declared incapable of giving satisfaction by some conceited puppy in Lemberg once on a time, and that his whole proceeding had been a pretence, since he knew full well it would not issue in a duel. Furthermore, the sole and only reason Zadowski had declined to institute proceedings was that all the world, himself included, was aware that his wife Jadwiga had provided him with a complete assortment of horns, as to the truth of which fact Japol would have found nothing easier than to give evidence, and that lastly the appearance of Krylov before a court would have been little edifying for anybody concerned. Anyhow, it was only his own honour that had been impeached, not that of his partner in the famous conversation. Von Sutowski had entrenched himself behind the fact in order not to involve himself in any danger. As for the role played by Herr von Asparetian in the whole affair, he preferred not to speak of it. But for the encounter in the Kirkhouse bar, he, Japol, though ready of tongue and wit, was admittedly of very feeble strength. He was at a great physical disadvantage with Sutowski and his friends and the uncommonly powerful Sutowska, while the two young ladies who were in his and Lenart's society were lively creatures enough, but timid as rabbits. Under the circumstances, and in order to avoid a free fight and public scandal, he had compelled Lenart, who would have put himself on the defensive, to be quiet, and to suffer in God's name the transient social contact with Messieurs von Sudowski and Lodigowski, which had not hurt them at all, and which had been regarded in the light of a pleasantry by the bystanders. Thus Japol, for whom of course not much could be said. His defence did not greatly invalidate the elegant contrast of honour with pusillanimity presented by the document on the other side, the less because he had not the manifolding facilities disposed of by his opponents, and could only distribute a few typed duplicates of his reply. The protocol, on the contrary, every one received, even the most uninterested. Nafta and Settembrini, for instance, had copies sent them, which Hans Castorp saw in their hands, and remarked to his surprise that they too perused them with bitter concentration. For him the ruling temper of the Berkoff was too much. He was powerless to dissipate its mood by a burst of blithe and cleansing laughter. But this he had confidently expected to hear from Herr Settembrini. Alas, no. Even the unclouded eye of the Freemason was dimmed by the prevailing spleen. It weighed on his spirit, stilling his mirth. It made him susceptible to the rasping provocation of the tale of the ear-boxing. Moreover, he, the protagonist of life, was suffering in spirit from the state of his health. Slowly, remorselessly, with deceptive interludes of brighter hope, it grew worse. He despised, he scorned it, and himself, but had reached the point where it obliged him, every few days, to take to his bed. His housemate and antagonist was no better off. The organic disease which had been the cause, or must we say pretext, for the untimely end to his activities within his order, made rapid progress. Even the high and thin conditions of life up here could not give it pause. Nafta, too, was often confined to his bed. The crack in his voice was more cracked than ever when he talked, and as his fever increased he talked more and more malignantly than ever. that ideal opposition to the forces of disease and death, the forced surrender of which before the superior power of abject nature gave Herr Settembrini such pain, was foreign to little Nafta. His way of taking the deterioration of his physical part was not with sorrow or aversion, but with a sort of jeering levity, an unnatural lust of combat, a mania of intellectual doubt, denial, and distraction, which was a sore irritant to the other's melancholy, and daily embittered more the intellectual quarrel between them. Hans Castorp, of course, could only speak of those at which he was present, but he felt tolerably sure he did not miss any, that his presence, the presence of the bone of pedagogic contention, was necessary to give rise to a disputation of any magnitude. And though he did not spare Herr Settembrini the pain of finding Nafta's gibes worth hearing, he had to admit that these were latterly going beyond all bounds, and often enough overstepping the borderline of mental sanity. End of section 48. Section 49 of The Magic Mountain, Volume 2, by Thomas Mann. Translated by Helen Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 49. Chapter 7. Hysterica Passio, Part 2. For this sufferer possessed neither the power nor the goodwill to rise above his illness, but rather saw all the world in its sign and image. In the presence of Herr Settembrini's quivering resentment, who would sooner have drawn his nursling away from the room or even stopped his ears, Nafta declared that matter was so bad a material that the spirit could not be realized within it. Any effort in that direction was sheer folly. Nothing could come of it but distortion and fatuity. What had been the net result of the vainglorious French Revolution? What but the capitalistic bourgeois state? A magnificent outcome, truly, and one it was hoped to improve upon, forsooth, by making the horror universal. A world republic, that would bring happiness beyond a doubt. Progress, it was the cry of the patient who constantly changes his position, thinking each new one will bring relief. The unconfessed, but secretly quite general desire for war was another manifestation of the same condition. It would come, this war, and it would be a good thing, though the consequences of it would not be those anticipated by its authors. Nafta sneered at the security of the bourgeois state. He took occasion to animadvert upon it one day in autumn, as they were walking on the main street. It came on to rain, and suddenly, as though at the word of command, all the world put up its umbrellas, which served Nafta as a symbol of the cowardice and vulgar softness engendered by civilized life. An incident like the going down of the Titanic was like the writing on the wall. It flung people back upon primitive conditions and fears, and thus was salutary. Afterwards, of course, came the great outcry that transportation must be safeguarded. Always the great outcry whenever security was threatened. It was pathetic, and the flabby humanitarianism of it went hand in hand with the wolfish cruelty and baseness of the economic conflict within the bourgeois state. War, war! For his part, he was for it. The general hankering seemed to him comparatively creditable. Herr Settembrini introduced the word justice into the discussion, and sought to apply this lofty principle as a preventative measure against political catastrophes, both foreign and domestic. But as soon as he did so, Nafta, who just previously had found the spiritual too high ever to succeed in manifesting itself in material form, now set to work to cast doubts on, to derogate from, that very spiritual. Justice! Was it as a conception worth worshipping? Was it first class? Was it of divine origin? God and nature were not even-handed. They played favourites. They exercised the right of choice. They graced one individual with dangerous distinction, to another granted the easy common lot. And as for the man of action, for him justice was on the one hand a paralysing weakness, doubt itself, on the other a trumpet call to unscrupulous deeds. And since, in order to remain within the moral code, such a man had always to correct justice in the second sense by justice in the first, where then was the absolute, the radical, in the conception? Moreover, one was just according to one standard or according to the other. All the rest was liberalism, in which nobody nowadays took any stock. Justice, in short, was an empty husk, a stock-in-trade of bourgeois rhetoric. To get down to business, one had always to know which justice one was dealing with, the one which would give a man his own, or the one which would give everybody alike. Out of his shoreless stream of words we have hit upon these in illustration of the way he sought to confound the reason. But even worse was the way he talked about science, in which he did not believe. He did not believe, he said, in it because it was permissible to exercise choice whether to believe in it or not. It was a belief like any other, only worse, stupider than any. The word science was the expression of the silliest realism, which did not blush to take at their face value the more than dubious reflections of objects in the human intellect, to pass them current, and to shape out of them the sorriest, most spiritless dogma ever imposed upon humanity. Was not the idea of a material world existing by and for itself the most laughable of all self-contradictions? But the modern natural sciences, as dogma, rested upon the metaphysical postulate that time, space, and causality, the forms of cognition in which all phenomena are enacted, are actual conditions existing independently of our knowledge of them. This monistic position was an insult to the spirit. Space, time, and causality, in monistic language, evolution. Here was the central dogma of a free-thinking, atheistical, bastard religion, by virtue of which one thought to supersede the first book of Moses and oppose the pure light of knowledge to a stultifying fable, as though Haeckel had been present at the creation. Empiricism, the universal ether, based on exact knowledge, of course. The atom, that pretty mathematical joke of the smallest, the indivisible particle of matter, its existence had been demonstrated undoubtedly. The doctrine of the illimitability of time and space was surely based on experience. In fact, anybody with very little logic could make very merry over the theory of the endlessness and the reality of space and time, and could arrive at the result of nothing. That is, at the view that realism is your true nihilism. How? Quite simply, since the relation to infinity of any size you choose to postulate was as zero. There was no size to the infinite. In eternity was neither duration nor change. In the spatially infinite, since every distance was mathematically as zero, there could not even be 2 points close together, to say nothing of 2 bodies, or of motion as such. He, Nafta, stated this in order to counter the arrogance of materialistic science, which gave out for absolute knowledge its astronomical quackery, its windbaggery about the universe. Pitiable humankind, that by a vain mustering of meaningless figures have let themselves be driven to a conclusion of their own insignificance, to the destruction of any emphasis upon their importance. It might be tolerable that human reason and knowledge should confine themselves to the terrestrial, and within this sphere treat as actual their experience with the subjective object. But let them go beyond that. Let them once attempt to grapple with the riddle of eternity and invent so-called cosmologies and cosmogonies. It was beyond a jest. The presumptuousness of it reached a climax. What blasphemous rubbish to reckon the distance of any star from the earth in terms of trillions of kilometres or in light years, and to imagine that with such a parade of figures the human spirit was gaining an insight into the essence of infinity and eternity, whereas infinity had absolutely nothing whatever to do with size, nor yet eternity with duration or distance in time. They had nothing in common with natural science, being as they were the abrogation of that which we call nature. Verily, the simplicity of a child who thinks the stars are holes in the tent of heaven, through which the eternal brightness shines, was 1,000 times more to his mind than the whole hollow, preposterous, overweening drivel of monistic science on the subject of the universe. Settembrini asked him if that about the stars represented his own personal belief. He answered that on this point he reserved to himself the freedom and the humble-mindedness of doubt, from which again it might be seen what he understood by freedom, and whither such a conception of it might lead. If only Herr Settembrini had not ground for the fear that Hans Castorp found all this highly worth listening to. Nafta's malicious wit lay in ambush to spy out the weaknesses of the nature-compelling forces of progress, and convict its standard-bearers and pioneers of human relapses into the irrational. Aviators, flying men, he said, were mostly a bad lot, untrustworthy, above all exceedingly superstitious. They carried mascots on board with them, pigs and ravens and such like. They spat 3 times in different directions. They wore the gloves of lucky flyers. How could such primitive unreason be reconciled with the conception of the universe which underlay their calling? The contradiction diverted him. He held forth upon it in extenso, but such illustrations of Nafta's malevolence are without number. Let us abandon them for the all too pertinent tale we have to tell. One afternoon in February, the gentlemen arranged an excursion to Monstein, some hour and a half from the village, by sleigh. The party consisted of Nafta and Settembrini, Hans Castorp, Ferge and Wesel. In 2 one-horse sleighs, Hans Castorp with the humanist, Nafta with Ferge and Wesel, the last named sitting with the coachman. They left the greengrocer's at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and well bundled up, drove off to the friendly music of bells that sounds so pleasant through still snowy air. They took the right-hand road, past Frauenkirch and Glaris, southwards. Storm clouds pushed up rapidly from that direction, and soon the only streak of blue in the sky lay behind them, over the Ratikon. The cold was severe, the mountains misty. The road, a narrow railingless shelf between mountain wall and abyss, rose steeply into the fir forests. They went at a foot-pace. Coasting parties rode downhill toward them, and had to dismount as they met. Sometimes from round a bend in the road would come the clear and warning sound of other bells. Sleighs driven tandem would be approaching, and some skill was required to pass in the narrow road. Near their destination was a beautiful view of a rocky stretch of the Zugenstrasse. They disentangled themselves from their wraps and climbed out in front of the little Monstein inn that called itself a Kurhaus, and went on foot a few steps further to get the view southwest towards the Stolzergrat. The gigantic wall, 3,000 metres high, was shrouded in vapours. Only one jagged tooth reared itself heavenward out of the mist, super-terrestrial, Valhallan, far and faint and awesomely inaccessible. Hans Castorp admired it immensely, and summoned the others to follow suit. It was he who, with due respect, dubbed it inaccessible, and afforded Herr Settembrini the chance of saying that this particular rock was considerably frequented, and in general that there were few spots where man had not set his foot. "That was rather tall talk," retorted Nafta, and mentioned Mount Everest, which to date had icily refused to surrender to man's importunity, and seemed likely to continue to do so. The humanist was put out. They returned to the Kurhaus, before which stood other unharnessed sleighs beside their own. One might have lodgment here. In the upper story were numbered rooms, and on the same floor the dining-room, furnished in peasant style and well heated. They ordered a bite from the obliging landlady. Coffee, honey, white bread, and pear bread, a sort of sweetmeat, the speciality of the place. Red wine was sent out to the coachman. At the other tables were sitting Swiss and Dutch visitors. We should have been glad to relate that our friends, being warmed and cheered by the hot and excellent coffee, proceeded to elevated discourse, but the statement would be inexact, for the discourse, after the first few words, took the form of a monologue by Nafta, and even as a monologue was conducted in a manner singularly offensive from the social point of view. The ex-Jesuit, flatly turning his back on Herr Settembrini, completely ignoring the other two gentlemen and devoting himself to Hans Castorp, to whom he held forth with marked affability. It would have been hard to give a name to the subject of this discourse, to which Hans Castorp listened, nodding from time to time as though in partial agreement. We may presume that it was scarcely a connected argument, but rather moved loosely in the realms of the intellectual, in general pointing out, with an accompanying comment, which we may characterize as cheerless, the equivocal nature of the spiritual phenomena of life, the changeful aspects and contentious unserviceability of the great abstract conceptions man has based on them, and indicating in what a rainbow-hued garment the Absolute appears upon this earth. At any rate, we may take as the nucleus of his lecture the problem of freedom, which he treated in the sense of confusion. He spoke, among other matters, of the Romantic movement at the beginning of the 19th century and its fascinating double meaning, pointing out how before it the conceptions of reaction and revolution went down, in so far as they were not incorporated in a new and higher one. For it was, of course, utterly absurd to try to associate the conception of revolution solely with progress and victoriously advancing enlightenment. The Romantic movement in Europe had been above all a movement of liberation, anti-classic, anti-academic, directed against French classicism, the old school of reason, whose defenders it derided as powdered Whigs. And NAFTA began upon wars of liberation, talking of Fichtean enthusiasms, of a singing, frenzied popular uprising against that unbearable tyranny at which, unfortunately, he tittered, freedom, that is to say, the revolutionary idea, had taken shape. Very droll it was. Singing loudly, the people had set out to shatter the revolutionary tyranny for the benefit of reactionary princely authority, and this they did in the name of freedom. The youthful listener would perceive the distinction, even the opposition, between foreign and domestic freedom. Also note the ticklish question, which unfreedom was soonest, which least compatible with a nation's honour? Freedom, indeed, was a conception rather romantic than illuminating. Like romanticism, it inevitably limited the human impulse to expansion, and the passionate individualism in them both had similar repressive results. Individualistic thirst for freedom had produced the historic and romantic cult of nationalism, which was warlike in character and was called sinister by humanitarian liberalism, though the latter also preached individualism, only the other way about. Individualism was romantic medieval in its conviction of the infinite, the cosmic, the importance of the single human being, whence was deduced the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, the geocentric doctrine, and astrology. But on the other hand, individualism was an aspect of liberalizing humanism, which inclined to anarchy and would in any case protect the precious individual from being offered up on the altar of the general. Such was individualism in its two aspects, all things unto all men. One had to admit that the freedom pathos had produced the most brilliant enemies of freedom, the most brilliant knight-errant of tradition at war with the irreverent, destructive progress. NAFTA cited Arndt, who cursed industrialism and glorified the nobility, and Gorez, the author of Christian mysticism. Perhaps his hearer would ask what mysticism had to do with progress. Had it not been anti-scholastic, anti-dogmatic, anti-priestly? One was indeed compelled to recognize in the hierarchy a force making for freedom. Had it not set limits to the boundless pretensions of monarchy? But the mysticism of the end of the Middle Ages had shown its liberal character as forerunner of the Reformation, which in turn had been an inextricable and tangled weave, a weft of freedom with a warp of medievalism. Oh yes, what Luther did possessed the merit of demonstrating crudely and vividly the dubious character of the deed itself, the deed in general. Did NAFTA's listener know what a deed was? A deed, for example, was the murder of Councillor Kotzebue by Sand, the theological student and member of the Burschenschaft. What was it, to speak the language of criminology, had put the weapon into the hand of young Sand? Enthusiasm for freedom, of course. But looked at more nearly, it had rather been a moral fanaticism and the hatred of light foreign ways. Kotzebue had been in the employ of Russia, in the service of the Holy Alliance, and thus Sand's shot had presumably been fired for freedom, which again declined into improbability by virtue of the circumstance that there were several Jesuits among his nearest friends. In short, whatever the deed might be, it was in any case a poor way of making one's meaning clear, as also it contributed little toward the clarification of intellectual problems. "Might I take the liberty of inquiring if you will be bringing these scurrilities of yours to an end before long?" Herr Settembrini put the question in withering tones. He had been drumming on the table and twisting his moustaches, but now his patience was exhausted. It was too much. He sat upright, and more than upright. He sat, so to speak, on tiptoe, for only his shanks touched the chair, and with flashing black eyes faced the enemy, who turned toward him in assumed surprise. "What, may I ask, was the expression you were pleased to use?" Nafta countered. "I was pleased to say," said the Italian, swallowing, "I am pleased to say that I am resolved to prevent you from continuing to molest a defenceless youth with your equivocations." "I invite you, sir, to take heed to your words." "The reminder, sir, is unnecessary. I am accustomed to take heed to my words. They will precisely fit the fact if I say that your way of misleading unsettled youth, of dissipating and undermining his moral and intellectual powers, is infamous, and cannot receive a stronger chastisement than it merits." With the word infamous, Settembrini struck the table with the flat of his hand, and pushing back his chair, stood up. It was a signal for the rest to do likewise. People looked across from the other tables, or rather from one, as the Swiss guests had left, and only the Dutchman remained, listening in amazement. At our table they all stood there stiffly, Hans Castorp and the two antagonists, with Ferge and Wesel opposite. All five were pale and wide-eyed, with twitching lips. Might not the three onlookers have made an effort to calm the troubled waters, to lighten the atmosphere with a jest, or bring affairs to a peaceful conclusion with some kind of human appeal? They did not try. The prevailing temper prevented them. They all stood, all trembling, with hands that clenched involuntarily into fists. Even A.K. Ferge, to whom all elevated thoughts were foreign, who disclaimed from its inception any power to measure the seriousness of the dispute, even he was convinced that this was a quarrel à outrance, and that there was nothing to do but let it take its course. His good-natured moustaches worked violently up and down. There was a stillness in which could be heard the gnashing of Nafta's teeth. To Hans Castorp this was an experience like the one with Wiedemann's hair. He had supposed it to be a figure of speech, something which did not actually occur. But here was Nafta, and in the silence his teeth could be heard to grate. A horribly unpleasant, a wild, incredible sound, yet which evinced a self-control equally fearsome, for he did not storm, but said in quite a low voice, though with a sort of cackling half-laugh, "Infamous chastisement! Ah, so the bleating sheep have taken to butting. Have we driven the policemen of civilization so far that they draw their weapons? That is a triumph. One in passing, I must say, considering what mild provocation sufficed to summon to arms the guardians of our morality. As for the rest, sir, it will follow in due course. The chastisement, too. I hope your civilian principles will not prevent you from knowing that you owe me, else I shall be forced to put these principles to test that—" Herr Settembrini drew himself up. The movement was so expressive that Nafta went on, "Ah, I see that will not be necessary. I am in your way. You are in mine. Good. We will transfer the settlement of our differences to a suitable place. For the moment, only this. Your sentimental solicitude for the scholastic interpretation of the Jacobin Revolution envisages a pedagogic crime in my manner of leading youth to doubt, of throwing categories to the wind, of robbing ideas of their academic dignity. And your anxiety is justified, for it happens on account of your humanity. Be assured of that. Happens and is done. For your humanity is today nothing but a tail end, a stale classicistic survival, a spiritual ennui. It is yawning its head off, while the new revolution, our revolution, my dear sir, is coming on apace to give it its quietus. We, when we sow the seeds of doubt deeper than the most up-to-date and modish free thought has ever dreamed of doing, we well know what we are about. Only out of radical sepsis, out of moral chaos, can the absolute spring, the anointed terror of which the time has need. This for your instruction and my justification. For the rest, we must turn over the page. You will hear from me." "And you will find a hearing, sir," Settembrini called after him, as the Jesuit left his place and hurried to the hat-stand to seek his cloak. Then the Freemason let himself fall back with a thud on his hard chair, and pressed both his hands to his heart. "Distruttore, cane arrabbiato, bisogna ammazzarlo," burst from him pantingly. The others stood still at the table. Fergier's moustaches went on wagging up and down. Vasil's jaw was set hard awry. Hans Castorp was imitating his grandfather's famous attitude, for his neck was all a-tremble. They were thinking how little they had expected such an outcome as this to their excursion, and all of them, even Herr Settembrini, felt how fortunate it was that they had come in 2 sleighs. It simplified the return. But what afterwards? "He challenged you," Hans Castorp said heavily. "Undoubtedly," answered Herr Settembrini, and cast a glance upward at his neighbour, only to turn away again at once and lean his head on his hand. "Shall you take it up?" Vasil wanted to know. "Can you ask?" answered Settembrini, and looked a moment at him too. "Gentlemen," he said then, and sat up, having brought himself again to a perfect control, "I regret the outcome of our pleasure excursion, but in life one must be prepared to reckon with such events. Theoretically, I disapprove of the duel. I am of a law-abiding temper. In practice, however, it is another matter. There are situations where, quarrels that... In short, I am at this man's service. It is well that in my youth I fenced a little. A few hours' practice will make my wrists supple again. Shall we go? The rendezvous will have to be made. I assume our gentlemen will already have ordered them to put to the horses." End of section 49. Section 50 of The Magic Mountain, Volume 2, by Thomas Mann. Translated by Helen Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 50. Chapter 7. Hysterica Passio. Part 3. Hans Castorp had moments, during the drive home and afterwards, when he became giddy in contemplation of what lay before them. Still more when it subsequently appeared that Nafta would not hear of cut and thrust, but insisted on a duel with pistols, and he, as the injured party, had the choice of weapons. There were moments, we say, when Hans Castorp was able, to a certain extent, to free himself from embroilment with the prevailing temper, and tell himself that all this was madness and must be prevented. "If even there were a real injury," he cried, in discussion with Herr Settembrini, Ferg, and Vasil. Nafta, on the way home, had invited the last named to be his second, and he acted as intermediary between the factions. An affront like that, purely civilian and social, if one of them had dragged the other's good name in the dirt, if it was a question of a woman, or anything else really momentous that you could take hold of, so that you felt there was no possibility of reconciliation, for such cases the duel is the last resort, and when honour is satisfied and the affair has gone off, with credit to all parties, and the antagonists part friends, as they say, why then it seems a very good arrangement, quite useful and practical too, in complicated cases. But what was it he did? I don't mean to stand up for him. I only ask what the insult consisted in. He threw the categories to the winds, as you say, and robbed conceptions of their academic dignity. And you felt yourself insulted thereby, justifiably, let us assume." "Assume?" repeated Herr Settembrini, and looked at him. "Oh, justifiably, quite justifiably. He affronted you, but he did not insult you. There is a difference. Permit me to say so. It was a matter of abstractions, an intellectual disagreement. On intellectual topics he could affront you, perhaps, but not insult you. That is axiomatic. Any court of honour would tell you the same. I swear to God they would. And so neither was your answer to him about infamy and chastisement an insult, because it was in the intellectual sense. The whole affair was in the intellectual sphere, and has nothing to do with the personal. And an insult can only be personal. The intellectual can never be personal. That is the conclusion and the explanation of the axiom, and therefore—" "You err, my friend," answered Settembrini, with closed eyes. "You err, first of all, in the assumption that the intellectual cannot assume a personal character. You should not think that," he said, and smiled a peculiarly fine and painful smile. "The point at which you go wrong is in your estimation of the things of the mind in general. You obviously think they are too feeble to engender conflicts and passions comparable for sternness with those real life brings forth, the only issue of which can be the appeal to force. Al incontro. The abstract, the refined upon, the ideal is at the same time the absolute. It is sternness itself. It contains within it more possibilities of deep and radical hatred, of unconditional and irreconcilable hostility than any relation of social life can. It astonishes you to hear that it leads, far more directly and inexorably than these, to radical intimacy, to grips, to the dual and actual physical struggle. The duel, my friend, is not an arrangement like another. It is the ultimate, the return to a state of nature, slightly mitigated by regulations which are chivalrous in character, but extremely superficial. The essential nature of the thing remains the primitive, the physical struggle. And however civilized a man is, it is his duty to be ready for such a contingency, which may any day arise. Whoever is unable to offer his person, his arm, his blood, in the service of the ideal, is unworthy of it. However intellectualized, it is the duty of a man to remain a man. Thus was Hans Castor put in his place. What should he answer? He preserved a depressed and brooding silence. Herr Settembrini spoke with composure, logically, but his words sounded strange in his mouth. His thoughts were not his own thoughts. The idea of the duel was one he would never have come upon himself. He had only taken it over from the terroristic little Nafta, and what he said was but an expression of the strength of that prevailing temper, whose tool and underling Herr Settembrini's fine understanding had become. What? The intellectual, simply because it was so stern, must lead relentlessly to the animal, to the issue of physical combat? Hans Castorp set himself against it, or at least he tried, only to discover in a fright that even he was powerless to do so. In him, too, the prevailing temper was strong. He was not the man to win free. There was an area of his brain where memory showed him Weidemann and Sonnenschein grappled like animals, and with horror he understood that at the end of everything only the physical remained, only the teeth and the nails. Yes, they must fight. Only thus could be assured even that small mitigation of the primitive by the rules of chivalry. Hans Castorp offered to act as Herr Settembrini's second. The offer was refused. No, it was not fitting, it would not do, he was told, first by Herr Settembrini himself, with that fine, rueful smile, then, after brief consideration, by Furge and Wesel, who also, without specified reason, found it would not do for Hans Castorp to assist at the encounter in this capacity. As a neutral party, perhaps, the presence of such a one was a part of the prescribed chivalrous mitigations. He might be present. Even Nafta, through his second, let it be known that this was his view, and Hans Castorp was satisfied. As witness, or as a neutral party, in either case he was able to exert his influence upon the details of the procedure now to be discussed and settled, an influence which proved necessary indeed. For Nafta's proposals went beyond all bounds. He demanded a distance of 5 paces, and, if necessary, 3 exchanges of fire. These insane conditions he sent by Vaisal the very evening of the quarrel. Vaisal had succeeded in fully identifying himself with Nafta's mad ideas, and partly as representative, but certainly also in accordance with his personal taste, obstinately insisted upon them. Settembrini, of course, found nothing in them to object to. But Ferge, as second, and the neutral Hans Castorp were beside themselves, and the latter fell heavily upon the wretched Vaisal. Was he not ashamed to bring forward such frantic and inhuman ideas to meet a case where the injury was purely abstract, not sensible at all? As though pistols were not bad enough, that they must add these murderous conditions. Where did the chivalrous mitigation come in? He might as well suggest firing across a handkerchief. He, Vaisal, was not going to be fired at 5 paces off. It was easy for him to be bloodthirsty. And so forth. Vaisal shrugged his shoulders, as much as to say that precisely the extreme case was a contingency, thus reducing to silence Hans Castorp, who was inclined to forget the fact. But he succeeded, during the negotiations of the following day, in fixing the number of shots at 1 instead of 3, and in dealing with the question of distance, so as to arrange that the combatants should be placed 15 paces apart, and have the right to advance 5 paces before firing. But in exchange for these concessions he had to promise that no attempt should be made at reconciling the parties. It was discovered that none of them had any pistols. Herr Albin had. Besides the shiny little revolver with which he loved to frighten the ladies, he had a pair of officers' pistols from Belgium in a velvet case. Browning automatics with brown wooden butts holding the magazine, blued steel mechanism and shining barrels with crisp little sights atop. Hans Castorp had seen them in Herr Albin's room, and against his own convictions, out of sheer compulsion from the prevailing temper, offered to borrow them. He made no concealment of the purpose they were to serve, but appealing to the young swaggerer's honour, readily swore him to secrecy. Herr Albin instructed him how to load the pistols, and they tested both weapons with blank shots in the open. All this took time. 2 days and 3 nights intervened between the quarrel and the meeting. The place was of Hans Castorp's choosing, that picturesque blue-blossoming scene of his retreat and stock-taking activities. On this spot the affair should take place on the 3rd morning, as soon as there should be light enough to see. The evening before, rather late, it occurred to Hans Castorp, by this time thoroughly wrought up, that there ought to be a physician present. He immediately advised with Ferge, who foresaw great difficulty. Rhadamanthus himself was an old corps student, but it would be impossible to ask the head of the establishment to act in an illegal affair, and between patients to boot. It was scarcely likely a doctor could be found who would be willing to lend a hand in a pistol duel between 2 severe cases. As for Kokowski, for all his brain, it was a question whether the technique of wound treatment would be his strong point. Vaisal, who was present, announced that Nafta had already expressed himself to the effect that he wanted no doctor. He was not going to the meeting place to be salved and bandaged, but to lay about him, and that in grim earnest. It sounded a sinister declaration enough, but Hans Castorp tried to interpret it as meaning that Nafta felt there would be no need of a physician. Ferge, too, bore back the message from Herr Settembrini that they might dispose of the question. It did not interest him. It was thus not unreasonable to hope that both antagonists had resolved not to let it come to the shedding of blood. 2 nights had passed since the quarrel, and there would be yet a 3rd. Time cools, time clarifies. No mood can be maintained quite unaltered through the course of hours. In the early dawn, standing weapons in hand, neither of the combatants would be the same man as on the evening of the quarrel. They would be going through it, if at all, mechanically, in obedience to the demands of honour, not, as they would have at first, of their own free will, desire, and conviction. And such a denial of their actual selves in favour of their past ones it must somehow be possible to prevent. Hans Castorp's reflections proved in the event not far from justified, but justified in a manner quite unlike he could have dreamed. So far as Herr Settembrini was concerned, he was entirely right. But had he suspected in what direction Leo Nafta would have altered his intentions beforehand, or at the decisive moment, not even the prevailing temper, of which all this was the outcome, could have driven him to let the affair go on. At 7 o'clock next morning the sun showed no sign of making an appearance above the mountain, yet the day was dawning difficultly, in a reek of mist, as Hans Castorp, after a restless night, left the Birkhoff to go to the rendezvous. The maidservants cleaning the hall looked after him in wonder. The house door, however, was unbolted. Ferge and Wesel, alone or in company, had undoubtedly passed that threshold, one to accompany Settembrini, the other Nafta, to the field of battle. He, Hans, went alone, his capacity of neutral not permitting him to attach himself to either party. He moved mechanically, under the compulsion of honour, under pressure from the prevailing temper. It was necessary for him to be present at the encounter. That went without saying. Impossible to stop away and await the event in bed, in the first place because... But he did not finish his firstly, but hastened on to the secondly, which was that one could not leave the thing to itself. Thus far, thank heaven, nothing dreadful had happened, and nothing dreadful need happen. It was really highly improbable that anything would. They had had to get up and dress by artificial light, and breakfastless in the bitter frost betake them to the appointed spot. But once there, under the influence of Hans Castorp's presence, the whole thing would surely be turned aside, worked out for good, in some manner not yet foreseen, and best left unguessed at, since experience showed that even the simplest events always worked out differently from what one would have thought beforehand. All which notwithstanding, this was the unpleasantest morning within his memory. He felt stale and seedy, his teeth tended to chatter. In the depth of his being he was prone to mistrust his own powers of self-control. These were such singular times. The lady from Minsk, who shattered her health on the point of a quarrel with her corsetière, the raging schoolboy, Weidemann and Sonnenschein, the Polish ear-boxes. Drearily he thought of them. Simply he could not picture two people before his eyes, in his presence, standing up to shoot at each other, spill each other's blood. But when he remembered what it had come to, what he had actually seen in the case of Weidemann and Sonnenschein, then he misdoubted himself, misdoubted all the world, and shivered in his fur jacket, though at the same time a feeling of the extraordinariness, the abnormality of all this, heightened by the quality of the early morning air, began now surprisingly to elevate and stimulate him. In the dusk of that slow brightening dawn, moved by such mingled and fluctuating hopes and feelings, he mounted the narrow path along the slope, from the village end of the Bob Run, arrived at the deeply drifted woods, crossed the little wooden bridge over the course, and followed a way among the tree trunks, trodden by feet in the snow rather than cleared by any shovel. He walked fast, and very soon overtook Settembrini and Ferge, the latter holding the case of pistols with one hand under his cloak. Hans Castorp did not hesitate to join them, and coming abreast was aware of Nafta and Wesel only a few paces in advance. "Cold morning, at least 18 degrees of frost," said he, in the purity of his intentions, but started at the frivolity of his own remark, and added, "Gentlemen, I am convinced." The others were silent. Ferge's good-natured moustache wagged up and down. After a while Settembrini came to a pause, took Hans Castorp's hand, laid his own other one upon it, and spoke. "My friend, I will not kill. I will not. I will offer myself to his bullet. That is all that honour can demand. But I will not kill. You may trust me." He released the young man and walked on. Hans Castorp was deeply moved. After a few steps he said, "That is splendid of you, Herr Settembrini. Now, on the other side, if he, for his part—" But Herr Settembrini shook his head. Hans Castorp reflected that if one party did not fire, the other would surely not be able to bring himself to do so either, and his heart perceptibly lightened. Everything was going well. His prediction seemed about to be verified. They crossed the footbridge over the gorge, where the waterfall hung stiff and silent. Nafta and Vasil were walking up and down before the bench, now upholstered with thick white cushions of snow, the bench on which Hans Castorp, lying to await the end of his nose-bleeding, had experienced such lively memories out of the distant past. Nafta was smoking a cigarette, and Hans Castorp questioned himself if he should do the same, but found he had no faintest desire. It seemed to him an affectation in the other. With the pleasure he always felt in these surroundings, he looked about at them in their icy state, and found them not less beautiful than in the season of their blue blossom time. The fir that jutted so boldly into the picture had its trunk and branches laden with snow. "Good morning," he said cheerily, with the idea of lending the scene a note of the natural which should help to dissipate its evil bearing, but was out of luck, for nobody answered. The greetings consisted in silent bows, so stiff as to be almost imperceptible. However, he was resolved to convert the energy of his walk, the splendid warmth engendered by brisk motion in the cold air, at once and without delay, to good purpose, and so began. "Gentlemen, I am convinced." "You will develop your convictions another time," Nafta cut him off icily. "The weapons, if you please," he added in the same arrogant tone. Hans Castorp, thus slapped on the mouth, had to look on while Ferge brought out the fatal étui from beneath his cloak, and handed one pistol to Vasil to pass on to Nafta. Settembrini took the other from Ferge's hand. The latter, in a murmur, asked them to make a space, and began measuring off the ground. He marked off the outer limits by lines dug with his heel in the snow, the inner by means of two canes, his own and Settembrini's. Our good-natured sufferer, what sort of work was this for him? Hans Castorp could not trust his eyes. Ferge was long-legged. He took proper strides. 15 paces at least were a goodly distance, but the cursed canes, alas, were not far apart at all. Certainly he was acting in all honour, but what a grip the prevailing temper had upon him, to enforce him to a procedure so monstrous in its significance. Nafta had flung his fur cloak on the ground, so that its mink lining showed. Pistol in hand, he moved to one of the outer barriers directly it was established, and while Ferge was still marking off the other. When that was fixed, Settembrini took up his position, his shabby fur coat open in front. Hans Castorp wrenched himself out of a stealing paralysis, and flung himself once more into the breach. "Gentlemen," he said, choking, "don't be hasty. It is my duty after all." "Silence!" cried out Nafta sharply. "Give the signal." But no one gave the signal. It had not been arranged for. Somebody, of course, ought to say "fire," but it had not been realized that it was the office of the neutral party to give the dread sign. At least it had not been mentioned. Hans Castorp remained silent, and nobody spoke in his place. "We will begin," Nafta declared. "Come forward, sir, and fire," he called across to his antagonist, and began himself to advance, holding the pistol at arm's length, directed at Settembrini, an unbelievable sight. Settembrini did the same. At the third step, the other, without firing, was already at the barrier. The Italian raised the pistol very high and fired. The shot awaked repeated echoes. The mountains flung back the sound and the rebound. The valley reverberated with the shock, until it seemed to Hans Castorp people must come running. "You fired in the air," Nafta said collectedly to Settembrini, letting his own weapon sink. Settembrini answered, "I fired where it pleased me to fire." "You will fire again." "I have no intention. It is your turn." Herr Settembrini, lifting his face toward the sky, had turned himself somewhat sidewise to his opponent. It was touching to realize he had heard one should not offer one's breast full face to an opponent's fire, and that he was acting according to the regulations. "Coward!" Nafta shrieked, and with this human shriek, confessing that it takes more courage to fire than to be fired upon, raised his pistol in a way that had nothing to do with duelling, and shot himself in the head. Piteous, unforgettable sight. He staggered or tottered while the mountains played ball with the sound of his shot. A few steps backward, flinging out his legs jerkily, executed a right turn with his whole body and fell with his face in the snow. They all stood rigid. Serimbrini, hurling his weapon from him, was first at Nafta's side. "Infelice!" he cried. "Che cosa fai, per l'amor di Dio?" Hans Castorp helped him turn the body over. They saw the black and red hole in the temple. They looked into a face that one would do well to cover with the silk handkerchief, one corner of which hung out of Nafta's breast pocket. End of section 50. Section 51 of The Magic Mountain, Volume 2, by Thomas Mann. Translated by Helen Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 51. Chapter 7. The Thunderbolt. 7 years Hans Castorp remained amongst those up here. Partisans of the decimal system might prefer a round number, though 7 is a good, handy number in its way. Picturesque, with a savour of the mythical. One might even say that it is more filling to the spirit than a dull academic half-dozen. Our hero had sat at all 7 of the tables in the dining-room, at each about a year, the last being the bad Russian table, and his company there 2 Armenians, 2 Finns, a Bokharian, and a Kurd. He sat at the bad Russian table, wearing a recent little blonde beard, vaguish in cut, which we are disposed to regard as a sign of philosophic indifference to his own outer man. Yes, we will even go further, and relate his carelessness of his person to the carelessness of the rest of the world regarding him. The authorities had ceased to devise him distractions. There was the morning inquiry as to whether he had slept well, itself purely rhetorical and summary, and, that aside, the Hofrat did not address him with any particularity, while Adriatica von Meilendonck, she had at the time of which we write a sty in a perfect state of maturity, did so seldom, in fact, scarcely ever. They let him be. He was like the scholar in the peculiarly happy state of never being asked any more, of never having a task, of being left to sit, since the fact of his being left behind is established and no one troubles about him further, an orgiastic kind of freedom. But we ask ourselves whether, indeed, freedom ever is or can be of any other kind. At all events, here was one on whom the authorities no longer needed to keep an eye, being assured that no wild or defiant resolves were ripening in his breast. He was settled, established. Long ago he had ceased to know where else he should go. Long ago he had ceased to be capable of a resolve to return to the flatland. Did not the very fact that he was sitting at the bad Russian table witness a certain abandon? No slightest adverse comment upon the said table being intended by the remark. Among all the 7, no single one could be said to possess definite tangible advantages or disadvantages. We make bold to say that here was a democracy of tables, all honourable alike. The same tremendous meals were served here as at the others. Rhadamanthus himself occasionally folded his huge hands before the doctor's place at the head, and the nations who ate there were respectable members of the human race, even though they boasted no Latin, and were not exaggeratedly dainty at their feeding. Time, yet not the time told by the station clock, moving with a jerk 5 minutes at once, but rather the time of a tiny timepiece, the hand of which one cannot see move, or the time the grass keeps when it grows. So unobservably one would say it does not grow at all, until some morning the fact is undeniable. Time, a line composed of a succession of dimensionless points, and now we are sure the unhappy deceased Nafta would interrupt us to ask how dimensionless points, no matter how many of them, can constitute a line. Time, we say, has gone on in its furtive, unobservable, competent way, bringing about changes. For example, the boy Teddy was discovered one day, not one single day, of course, but only rather indefinitely from which day, to be a boy no longer. No more might ladies take him on their laps, when, on occasion, he left his bed, changed his pyjamas for his knickerbockers, and came downstairs. Imperceptibly that leaf had turned. Now, on such occasions, he took them on his instead, and both sides were as well or even better pleased. He was become a youth. Scarcely could we say he had bloomed into a youth, but he had shot up. Hans Castorp had not noticed it happening, and then suddenly he did. The shooting up, however, did not suit the lad Teddy. The temporal became him not. In his 21st year he departed this life, dying of the disease for which he had proved receptive, and they cleansed and fumigated after him. The fact makes little claim upon our emotions, the change being so slight between his one state and his next. There were other deaths, and more important. Deaths down in the flatland which touched, or would once have touched, our hero more nearly. We are thinking of the recent decease of old Consul Tiernapple, Hans's great-uncle and foster-father of faded memory. He had carefully avoided unfavourable conditions of atmospheric pressure, and left it to Uncle James to stultify himself. Yet an apoplexy carried him off after all, and a telegram, couched in brief but feeling terms, feeling more for the departed than for the recipient of the wire, was one day brought to Hans Castorp, where he lay in his excellent chair. He acquired some black-bordered note-paper, and wrote to his uncle-cousins. He, the doubly, now, so to say, triply orphaned, expressed himself as being the more distressed over the sad news. For that, circumstances forbade him interrupting his present sojourn, even to pay his great-uncle the last respects. To speak of sorrow would be disingenuous. Yet in these days Hans Castorp's eyes did wear an expression more musing than common. This death, which could at no time have moved him greatly, and after the lapse of years could scarcely move him at all, meant the sundering of yet another bond with the life below, gave to what he rightly called his freedom the final seal. In the time of which we speak, all contact between him and the flatland had ceased. He sent no letters thither, and received none thence. He no longer ordered Maria Mancini cigars, having found a brand up here to his liking, to which he was now as faithful as once to his old-time charmer, a brand that must have carried even a polar explorer through the sorest and severest trials, armed with which, and no other solace, Hans Castorp could lie and bear it out indefinitely, as one does at the sea-shore. It was an especially well-cured brand, with the best leaf wrapper, named Light of Asia, rather more compact than Maria, mouse-grey in colour, with a blue band, very tractable and mild, and evenly consuming to a snow-white ash, which held its shape and still showed traces of the veining on the wrapper, so evenly and regularly that it might have served the smoker for an hourglass, and did so at need, for he no longer carried a timepiece. His watch had fallen from his night table. It did not go, and he had neglected to have it regulated, perhaps on the same grounds as had made him long since give up using a calendar, whether to keep track of the day, or to look out an approaching feast, the grounds, namely, of his freedom. Thus he did honour to his abiding everlasting, his walk by the ocean of time, the hermetic enchantment to which he had proved so extraordinarily susceptible, that it had become the fundamental adventure of his life, in which all the alchemistical processes of his simple substance had found full play. Thus he lay, and thus in high summer the year was once more rounded out, the 7th year, though he knew it not, of his sojourn up here. Then, like a thunder-peal, But God forbid, and modesty withhold us from speaking overmuch of what the thunder-peal bore us on its wave of sound. Here the rhodomontade is out of place. Rather let us lower our voice to say that then came the peal of thunder we all know so well, that deafening explosion of long-gathering magazines of passion and spleen, that historic thunder-peal of which we speak with bated breath, made the foundations of the earth to shake. But for us it was the shock that fired the mine beneath the magic mountain, and set our sleeper ungently outside the gates. Dazed, he sits in the long grass and rubs his eyes, a man who, despite many warnings, had neglected to read the papers. His Mediterranean friend and mentor had ever tried to prompt him, had felt it incumbent upon him to instruct his nursling, the object of his solicitude, in what was going on down below. But his pupil had lent no ear. The young man had indeed, in a stock-taking way, preoccupied himself with this or that among the subjective shadows of things, but the things themselves he had heeded not at all, having a wilful tendency to take the shadow for the substance, and in the substance to see only shadow. For this, however, we must not judge him harshly, since the relation between substance and shadow has never been defined once and for all. Long ago it had been Herr Settimbrini who had brought sudden illumination into the room, sat down beside the horizontal hands, and sought to influence and instruct him upon the matters of life and death. But now it was the pupil who, seated with his hands between his knees at the bedside of the humanist, or near his couch in the cosy and retired little mansard study, with the carbonaro chairs and the water-bottle, kept him company, and listened courteously to his utterances upon the state of Europe, for in these days Herr Ludovico was seldom on his legs. Nafta's violent end, the terroristic deed of that desperate antagonist, had dealt his sensitive nature a blow from which it could scarcely rally. Weakness and infirmity had since been his portion. He could no longer work on the sociological pathology. The League waited in vain for that lexicon of all the masterpieces of letters, having human suffering for their central theme. Herr Ludovico had perforce to limit to oral efforts his contribution to the organization of progress, and even so much he must have foregone had not Hans Castop's visits given him opportunity to spread his gospel. His voice was weak, but he spoke with conviction, at length and beautifully, upon the self-perfecting of the human spirit through social betterment. Softly, as though on the wings of doves, came the words of Herr Ludovico. Yet again, when he came to speak of the unification and the universal well-being of the liberated peoples, there mingled a sound, he neither knew nor willed it, of course, as of the rushing pinions of eagles. That was the political key, the grandfatherly inheritance that united in him with the humanistic gift of the father to make up the litterateur, precisely as humanism and politics united in the lofty ideal of civilization, an ideal wherein were blended the mildness of doves and the boldness of eagles. That ideal was only biding its time until the day dawned, the day of the people, when the principle of reaction would be laid low and the holy alliance of civic democracies take its place. Yes, here seemed to sound two voices with differing counsels, for Herr Settimbrini was a humanitarian, yet at the same time, half explicitly, he was warlike too. In the duel with the outrageous little Nafta he had borne himself like a man, but in general it still remained rather vague what his position was to be, when humanity in an outburst of enthusiasm united itself with politics in support of a triumphant and dominating world civilization, and the burgher's pike was dedicated upon the altar of humanity. There was some doubt whether he would then hold back his hand from the shedding of blood. Yes, it seemed the prevailing temper more and more held sway in the Italian's mind and view. The boldness of the eagle was gradually outbidding the mildness of the dove. Not infrequently his attitude toward the existing great political systems was divided, embarrassed, disturbed by scruples. the diplomatic rapprochement between his country and Austria, their cooperation in Albania, had reflected itself in his conversation, a cooperation that raised his spirits in that it was directed against Latinless half Asia, Knaut, Schlüsselburg, and all, yet tormented them in that it was a misbegotten alliance with the hereditary foe, with the principle of reaction and subjugated nationalities. The autumn previous, the great French loan to Russia for the purpose of building a network of railways in Poland had awakened in him similar misgivings, for Herr Settembrini belonged to the Francophile party in his own country, which was not surprising when one recalled that his grandfather had compared the 6 days of the July Revolution to the 6 days of the creation, and seen that they were good. But the understanding between the enlightened Republic and Byzantine Scythia was too much for him. It oppressed his breast, and at the same time made him breathe quicker for hope and joy at the thought of the strategic meaning of that network of railways. Then came the Sarajevo murder, for everyone excepting German seven sleepers a storm signal, decisive for the informed ones, among whom we may reckon Herr Settembrini. Hans Castorp saw him shudder as a private citizen at the frightful deed, while at the same time his breast heaved with the knowledge that this was a deed of popular liberation directed against the citadel of his loathing. On the other hand, was it not also the fruit of Muscovite activity, and as such giving rise to great heart-searchings, which did not hinder him, 3 weeks later, from characterizing the extreme demands of the monarchy upon Serbia as a hideous crime and an insult to human dignity, the consequences of which he could foresee well enough, and awaited in breathless excitement. In short, Herr Settembrini's feelings were as complex as the fatality he saw fast rolling up, for which he sought by hints and half-words to prepare his pupil, a sort of national courtesy and compunction preventing him from speaking out. In the first days of mobilization, the first declaration of war, he had a way of putting out both hands to his visitor, taking Hans Castorp's own and pressing them, that fairly went out to our young Noodle's heart, if not precisely to his head. "My friend," the Italian would say, "gunpowder, the printing press, yes, you have certainly given us all that, but if you think we could march against the revolution, caro." During those days of stifling expectation, when the nerves of Europe were on the rack, Hans Castorp did not see Herr Settembrini. The newspapers, with their wild, chaotic contents, pressed up out of the depths to his very balcony. They disorganized the house, filled the dining-room with their sulphurous, stifling breath, even penetrated the chambers of the dying. These were the moments when the seventh sleeper, not knowing what had happened, was slowly stirring himself in the grass before he sat up, rubbed his eyes. Yes, let us carry the figure to the end in order to do justice to the movement of our hero's mind. He drew up his legs, stood up, looked about him. He saw himself released, freed from enchantment, not of his own motion, he was fain to confess, but by the operation of exterior powers, of whose activities his own liberation was a minor incident indeed. Yet though his tiny destiny fainted to nothing in the face of the general, was there not some hint of a personal mercy and grace for him, a manifestation of divine goodness and justice? Would life receive again her erring and delicate child, not by a cheap and easy slipping back to her arms, but sternly, solemnly, penitentially, perhaps not even among the living, but only with 3 salvos fired over the grave of him a sinner? Thus might he return. He sank to his knees, raising face and hands to a heaven that, howsoever dark and sulphureous, was no longer the gloomy grotto of his state of sin. And in this attitude Herr Settembrini found him, figuratively and most figuratively spoken, for full well we know our hero's traditional reserve would render such theatricity impossible. Herr Settembrini, in fact, found him packing his trunk, for since the moment of his sudden awakening, Hans Castorp had been caught up in the hurry and scurry of a wild departure brought about by the thunder-peal. Home, the Burkhoff, was the picture of an ant-hill in a panic, Its little population was flinging itself, heels over head, 5,000 feet downwards, to the catastrophic smitten flatland. They stormed the little trains, they crowded them to the footboard, luggageless if needs must, and the stacks of luggage piled high the station platform, the seething platform, to the height of which the scorching breath from the flatlands seemed to mount, and Hans Castorp stormed with them. In the heart of the tumult, Ludovico embraced him, quite literally enfolded him in his arms and kissed him, like a southerner, but like a Russian too, on both his cheeks, and this, despite his own emotion, took our wild traveller no little aback. But he nearly lost his composure when, at the very last, Herr Settembrini called him Giovanni, and, laying aside the form of address common to the cultured West, spoke to him with the thou. "E così in qui," he said, "così vai in qui finalmente. Addio, Giovanni mio. Quite otherwise had I thought to see thee go. But be it so. The gods have willed it thus and not otherwise. I hoped to discharge you to go down to your work, and now you go to fight among your kindred. My God, it was given to you and not to your cousin, our tenente. What tricks life plays! Go then, it is your blood that calls. Go and fight bravely. More than that can no man. But forgive me if I devote the remnant of my powers to incite my country to fight where the spirit and sacro egoismo point the way. Addio." Hans Castorp thrust out his head among 10 others, filling the little open window frame. He waved, and Herr Settembrini waved back with his right hand, while with the ring finger of his left he delicately touched the corner of his eye. What is it? Where are we? Whither has the dream snatched us? Twilight, rain, filth, fiery glow of the overcast sky, ceaseless booming of heavy thunder, the moist air rent by a sharp singing whine, a raging, swelling howl as of some hound of death, that ends its course in a splitting, a splintering and sprinkling, a crackling, a coruscation, by groans and shrieks, by trumpets blowing fit to burst, by the beat of a drum coming faster, faster. There is a wood, discharging drab hordes that come on, fall, spring up again, come on. Beyond, a line of hill stands out against the fiery sky, whose glow turns now and again to blowing flames. About us is rolling ploughland, all upheaved and trodden into mud. Athwart it a bemired high-road, disguised with broken branches, and from it again a deeply furrowed, boggy field path, leading off in curves toward the distant hills. Nude, branchless trunks of trees meet the eye. A cold rain falls. Ah, a signpost. Useless, though, to question it, even despite the half-dark, for it is shattered, illegible. East, west? It is the flatland, it is the war, and we are shrinking shadows by the wayside, shamed by the security of our shadowdom, and no ways minded to indulge in any rhodomontade, merely led hither by the spirit of our narrative, merely to see again among those running, stumbling, drum-mustered grey comrades that swarm out of yonder wood one we know, merely to look once more in the simple face of our one-time fellow of so many years, the genial sinner whose voice we know so well, before we lose him from our sight. They have been brought forward, these comrades, for a final thrust in a fight that has already lasted all day, whose objective is the retaking of a hill position and the burning villages beyond, lost 2 days since to the enemy. It is a volunteer regiment, fresh young blood, and mostly students, not long in the field. They were roused in the night, brought up in trains to morning, then marched in the rain on wretched roads, on no roads at all, for the roads were blocked, and they went over the moor and ploughed land with full kit for 7 hours, their coats sodden. It was no pleasure excursion. If one did not care to lose one's boots, one stooped every second step, clutched with one's fingers into the straps, and pulled them out of the quaking mire. It took an hour of such work to cover one meadow, But at last they have reached the appointed spot, exhausted, on edge, yet the reserve strength of their youthful bodies has kept them tense. They crave neither the sleep nor the food they have been denied. Their wet, mud-bespattered faces, framed between strap and grey-covered helmet, are flushed with exertion, perhaps, too, with the sight of the losses they suffered on their march through that boggy wood. For the enemy, aware of their advance, have concentrated a barrage of shrapnel and large-calibre grenades upon the way they must come. It crashed among them in the wood, and howling, flaming, splashing, lashed the wide ploughed land. They must get through, these 3,000 ardent youths. They must reinforce with their bayonets the attack on the burning villages and the trenches in front of and beyond the line of hills. They must help to advance their line to a point indicated in the dispatch their leader has in his pocket. They are 3,000, that they may be 2,000 when the hills, the villages are reached. That is the meaning of their number. They are a body of troops calculated as sufficient, even after great losses, to attack and carry a position, and greet their triumph with 1,000-voiced huzzah, not counting the stragglers that fall out by the way. Many a one has fallen out on the forced march, for which he proved too young and weak. Paler he grew, staggered, set his teeth, drove himself on, and after all he could do, fell out notwithstanding. A while he dragged himself in the rear of the marching column, overtaken and passed by company after company. At length he remained on the ground, lying where it was not good to lie. Then came the shattering wood. But there are so many of them swarming on, they can survive a bloodletting and still come on in hosts. They have already overflowed the level, rain-lashed land, the high road, the field road, the boggy ploughed land. We, shadows, stand amid and among them. At the edge of the wood they fix their bayonets with the practised grips. The horns enforce them, the drums roll deeper space, and forward they stumble, as best they can, with shrill cries, nightmarishly, for clods of earth cling to their heavy boots and fetter them. They fling themselves down before the projectiles that come howling on. Then they leap up again and hurry forward. They exult in their young, breaking voices as they run, to discover themselves still unhit. Or they are hit. They fall, fighting the air with their arms, shot through the forehead, the heart, the belly. They lie, their faces in the mire, and are motionless. They lie, their backs elevated by the knapsack, the crowns of their heads pressed into the mud, and clutch and claw in the air. But the wood emits new swarms, who fling themselves down, who spring up, who, shrieking or silent, blunder forward over the fallen. Ah, this young blood, with its knapsacks and bayonets, its mud-befouled boots and clothing. We look at it. Our humanistic aesthetic eye pictures it among scenes far other than these. We see these youths watering horses on a sunny arm of the sea, roving with the beloved one along the strand, the lover's lips to the ear of the yielding bride, in happiest rivalry bending the bow. Alas, no, here they lie, their noses in fiery filth. They are glad to be here, albeit with boundless anguish, with unspeakable sickness for home. And this of itself is a noble and a shaming thing, but no good reason for bringing them to such a pass. There is our friend. There is Hans Castorp. We recognize him at a distance by the little beard he assumed while sitting at the bad Russian table. Like all the others, he is wet through and glowing. He is running, his feet heavy with the mould, the bayonet swinging in his hand. Look, he treads on the hand of a fallen comrade. With his hobnail boot he treads the hand deep into the slimy, branch-strewn ground. But it is he. What? Singing? As one sings unaware, staring stark ahead. Yes, thus he spends his hurrying breath, to sing half soundlessly. And loving voices I've carven upon its branches fair. He stumbles. No, he has flung himself down. A hellhound is coming howling, a huge explosive shell, a disgusting sugar loaf from the infernal regions. He lies with his face in the cool mire, legs sprawled out, feet twisted, heels turned down. The product of a perverted science, laden with death, slopes earthward 30 paces in front of him and buries its nose in the ground, explodes inside there with hideous expense of power, and raises up a fountain, high as a house, of mud, fire, iron, molten metal, scattered fragments of humanity. Where it fell, 2 youths had lain, friends who in their need flung themselves down together. Now they are scattered, commingled and gone. Shame of our shadow safety! Away, no more! But our friend, was he hit? He thought so, for a moment. A great clod of earth struck him on the shin. It hurt, but he smiles at it. Up he gets, and staggers on, limping on his earthbound feet, all unconsciously singing. Its waving branches whisper a message in my ear. And thus, in the tumult, in the rain, in the dusk, vanishes out of our sight. Farewell, honest Hans Castorp, farewell, life's delicate child. Your tale is told. We have told it to the end, and it was neither short nor long, but hermetic. We have told it for its own sake, not for yours, for you were simple. But after all, it was your story. It befell you. You must have more in you than we thought. We will not disclaim the pedagogic weakness we have conceived for you in the telling, which could even lead us to press a finger delicately to our eyes at the thought that we shall see you no more, hear you no more forever. Farewell. If thou livest or diest, thy prospects are poor. The desperate dance in which thy fortunes are caught up will last yet many a sinful year. We should not care to set a high stake on thy life by the time it ends. We even confess that it is without great concern we leave the question open. Adventures of the flesh and in the spirit, while enhancing thy simplicity, granted thee to know in the spirit what in the flesh thou scarcely couldst have done. Moments there were when out of death and the rebellion of the flesh there came to thee, as thou tookest stock of thyself, a dream of love. Out of this universal feast of death, out of this extremity of fever, kindling the rain-washed evening sky to a fiery glow, may it be that love one day shall mount. Finis operis. End of section 51. End of volume 2 of The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Read by Steve Goff between 2022 and 2024 in London, UK.